Oh, sorry. Hello, YouTube. I didn't tell it to go live yet, so I didn't expect it to go live without me. I am Shaggy. I am Philalitea. I was just looking at what I'm going to be reading to make sure that it makes sense to just pick up in the middle of this book and not to try to set up what I'm talking about. But I'm not going to set up what I'm talking about. I am going to take a second to remember how to use this live setup because I don't exactly remember what it's going to let me do. I can like make the background different if I wanted. I could be like floating in space, or I could be like in some text. Can I make myself real small? No. But there you go. I could like put myself in text, or I could put myself in a funny picture. Why am I doing this? Hello, audience member. I'm still getting set up and I'm playing with the green screen. I don't know why either. I'm going to be reading from this book. It's called Ghosts in the Middle Ages. That's probably difficult for you to read, by Jean-Claude Schmitt. It's a seminal scholarly and academic work about ghosts in the Middle Ages. And I want to talk about The Wild Hunt because I have a Patreon subscriber who is interested in the Witcher series, and so I want to just talk about The Wild Hunt as it is in scholarship and as it was presented before about 1200, because the Witcher series, I think it picks up around 1300. And so I just kind of want to read it again, because when I read it, I found it interesting, and it's chilly and it's beautiful and sunny out today, and I've got a full external battery and about 30% of my own battery, and I want to do something, so I'm going to read for you. Thank you for sitting through that introduction. The reason that I put you through that introduction is because this passage, I'm going to be starting in chapter 5 of this book. The passage that I'm going to be opening on begins with a class of ghost story that was collected by monks and priests in the Middle Ages, called a mirabilia or mirabilia. I don't know which is probably mirabilia. Hello, I can't speak. I can't read Cyrillic, so I can't say your name out loud. But hello. Thank you, Sips. And so the important thing here isn't necessarily that I'm going to be talking about mirabilia or the other. There are 3 kinds of ghost story that were recorded by the scholars of the world between 500 and 1200 AD, and they use 3 words for their classification system, and I don't remember right off the top of my head exactly what the differences in the 3 were, because thank you for the comments, guys. Because the 3 things were different in their own right, but I don't want to talk about that. I just kind of want to talk about the Hela thing and Harlequin, and I kind of want to talk about how the Batman character Harlequin is actually not unrelated to the medieval character, even though I'm not sure that the DC characters meant to do that. And so I'm just going to continue reading. Yes. Thank you for the comments and the likes. Thank you for being here. That's a really awesome outpouring of support that I'm going to be reading. And so again, the author is Jean-Claude Schmitt, and I'm not trying to steal his work. The end, I think you should do what suits your soul, buddy. If a doctor is really telling you that there's a chance you could never drum again, I think about Brent Hines from the band Mastodon. He was told after a brain injury that he would never play guitar again, and he's still playing guitar, whatever that was, 10 or 20 years ago. I'm going to call you Repa, because I can't pronounce those letters. Thank you. You don't have to worry about sending me money. If you want to send me money after the stream is over or whatever, you can worry about that then. I'm not super worried about that. I want to read, because this book is on my mind and I can't communicate. I can't communicate anything else I'm thinking about without communicating this, and I've tried. I can't communicate this without the book itself. So let's have some shared information. So I'm not stealing. I want to make it very clear that this is Jean-Claude Schmitt's work. I'm not stealing from him. I'm trying to honor his work by sharing it with an audience that would have no access. So please, if you want to send me money, before you send me money, buy this book. It's not cheap. Thank you for that. Okay, so Tales of Mirabilia did not deal only with apparitions of individual ghosts. Such tales are even more interesting when one notes how they readily included the folkloric traditions of the hosts of the dead. The hosts of the dead are gods of the underworld. In fact, the 12th century marked the first appearance in these texts of the term Harlequin's hunt, found in diverse forms to the present day. Its earliest mention can be attributed to an Anglo-Norman monk, Orderic Vitalis, from 1075 to 1142 is when he lived. Okay, so the subtitle of this chapter is The Account of Orderic Vitalis. Orderic was the son of a cleric from Orléans, that's in France, who had entered into the service of a Norman nobleman. Normandy is the northern part of France. I don't know where Orléans is. After the conquest of England and the region of Mercia on the border of Wales. So we're talking about during or after the conquest by William the Great. It was here that Orderic was born and spent his early childhood. When he was 10, his father, who had maintained ties with Normandy, sent him as an oblate to the Abbey of Saint Evroul in the Diocese of Lisieux, where he would spend the rest of his life. Okay, so an oblate is a child that's sacrificed to the religious community to be raised and educated as a religious person to then give back to the community the benefits of religion. That's not something we do anymore. It's something that started going away around the 1500s. But in 1132, it was a very strong tradition. Obviously, this guy was raised that way, and it wasn't something that anybody thought was funny or weird. Yes, thank you, Sips and others. Yeah, you know, everybody needs money. In Orderic's time, the abbey was an important link in the monastic reform that was occurring in Normandy under the influence of the Abbey of Fécamp, reformed by William of Oppiano, and of Cluny. In 1132, Orderic was himself sent to Cluny, which was then under the abbacy of Peter Venerable. It doesn't really matter. You don't need all of this, but you also need to understand that at the same time that all of these ghost stories were being collected, especially by people who became very famous, like Orderic Vitalis, there was a lot of institutional learning already happening within the Christian community. Saint Evroul was struggling for its independence from the two powers that were threatening it. These are churches, not people anymore. The bishop of Lisieux and the seigneurs of the region, in particular the fearsome Lord Robert of Bellême. At Saint Evroul, Orderic undertook to write the 13 books of his ecclesiastical history, a monumental history of the Normans. In his mind, this work was to be for the Normans what Bede's ecclesiastical history was for the English, and Bede's ecclesiastical history is an awesome read. I love it. Orderic compiled written documents, but with the third book, he collected primarily contemporary oral accounts. This is important. The oral account thing is important. The collecting oral accounts, just basically like what the Warrens did. You just go around and you collect stories from people. You see what I'm saying? His informants were the monks of Saint Evroul and also nobles and knights from the region. I'm probably pronouncing that French town wrong. People whom he considered the best resources for the Norman memory, people in the best position to tell him about the conquests, the sieges, the battles, the alliances, and the successions that made up the focus of his narrative. In the history of the Normans, was it not the Duke and the nobles who played the primary roles? He also called on his own memories. He wrote most of his work between 1123 and 1137, and most of Book 8, which is of immediate interest to us, between 1133 and 1135. Thank you for the subscription, Morgan. I do appreciate the, thank you for the compliments. I appreciate the churn in the comments. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for the support. I really mean it. Thank you for the subscription, Sips. Okay. In chapter 16 of book 8, and again at the beginning of chapter 18, Orderic dwells on Robert of Bellême's misdeeds, which occurred around 45 years earlier. That's important because nobody would have spanned that gap of 45 years. All you would have had is cultural memory, and not, you wouldn't have had many people who were alive for 45 years. Robert of Bellême was an evil lord. The way they say that in Latin is nequismus pessimus, says Orderic. whose cruelty was equaled only by that of his mother, Mabel. She had her prisoners assassinated. Robert of Balaam was the sworn enemy, I think that's how you pronounce that, of the protector of Saint Evroul, Hugh of Grandmesnil, whom he besieged in Corsi in 1091. It is within this context, in the same year and in the same region, that the apparition of Heliquin's hunt is mentioned. So now we're at the wild hunt. So who's Heliquin? We'll find out. Orderic heard the tale directly from the witness, a young priest named Walchelin. This is a great story, and I'm so glad I'm getting to read this. Who served the church of Bonneval, which belonged to Saint Aubin of Angers. During the night of January 1st, 1091, Walchelin was returning from a visit he had paid to a sick member of his parish when, alone and far from any dwelling, he heard the din of a great army, which he assumed belonged to Robert of Balaam, en route for the siege of Corsi. The night was clear. The priest was young, courageous, and strong. And doesn't this sound like every ghost story or every UFO story you've ever heard? The night was clear, you hear a loud noise, you go investigate because you're a strapping young lad. He sought shelter among 4 medlar trees, ready to defend himself if necessary. At that moment there appeared before him a great man who was armed with a mace, and who ordered him to remain where he was and watch the procession of the army, which is here translated exercitus or exercitus, which was coming in successive waves. And so what you have to remember if you're thinking about this scene from Orderic's mindset is you have to remember stories from World War I, when armies used to march in columns through towns to let those towns know just how much killing might they had. And so this guy, he's walking around outside along the road, and he hears a loud noise that sounds like a lot of people walking in the same direction toward him. So he hides behind some trees, and a guy appears from him, a great big dude in armor carrying a mace. And if you don't know what a mace is, it's a ball of iron on the end of a metal stick. And so it's a killing weapon. And he tells him to watch this army pass. And so if you know angel stories, or you know UFO stories, or you know abduction stories, this is a very common trope in those stories today, 800 or 900 years almost after this story. The first group was the most ill assorted. It formed a great crowd on foot, with beasts of burden, laden with clothing and every kind of furnishing and household goods, like robbers bending under the weight of their plunder. The people hurried along. Robbers here means robber soldiers, not like we think of people who enter people's houses and take things. He means soldiers who are leaving a town with all of the loot they can carry on their back, that kind of robber. The people hurried along, lamenting, and among them the priest recognized some of his neighbors who had recently died. Then came a band of bearers, Turma Vespilionum, whom the giant joined. The bearers are probably flag bearers. This was originally in French, and I don't know if the localization to English was the best that was ever done. These bearers were carrying 2 men each, some 50 biers, on which sat dwarves with unusually large heads, the shape of barrels. This is really interesting. The dwarves with unusually large heads sounds to me like gray aliens as described by people around Roswell. 2 Ethiopians, that Orderic Vitalis calls black demons, were carrying an enormous tree trunk on which a wretched man, bound and wailing in pain, was being tortured. A fearful demon, sitting on the trunk, was goading his back and sides with red-hot spurs. Walchelin recognized the poor man. 2 years earlier, the man had killed the priest Stephen and had died without completing his penance for his crime. Next came a troop of women on horseback, riding on side saddles covered with burning nails. The side saddle is different than the English saddle, right? So, like women, when they rode back in the day, they didn't ride straddling the horse like, like champion or like competition riders today. They rode in a special saddle that was a seat that allowed them to sit sideways on the horse like this, so they didn't have the, saddle between their legs. Moving on. These side saddles have nails in the seats. So even in the relative comfort of riding in these side saddles, their bottoms are being burned by burning nails. The wind unremittingly lifted these women several feet from the saddles, then dropped them painfully back onto the sharp points. Their breasts were pierced with the nails heated in the fire, which caused them to shriek out, bewailing their sins. And obviously this isn't sexy nipple piercings. This is like they're being poked with hot nails in the boobies, the soft flesh. Their breasts, these women, among whom Walchelin recognized several noble women, had lived lives of debauchery and ostentation. Debauchery is doing things like eating and drinking and carousing in ways you're not supposed to, and ostentation is dressing in fine clothing and believing that you're better than other people. The terrified priest then saw a great troop of clergy and monks, led by bishops and abbots, with pastoral staves. The clergy and bishops were wearing black caps, and the monks and abbots wore black cowls. They lamented and begged Walchelin, whom they called by name, to pray for them. The priest was shocked to find among them men whom he had held in great esteem before their deaths, notably the Bishop Hugh of Lisieux, died 1077, and the abbots Mainet of Saint Evroul, died 1089, and Gerber of Saint Wandrille. I think that's Wandrille. I don't know how to speak French. If that were Spanish, it'd be Wandrilla. But only God could know people's hearts and decide to subject sinners to the various purifications of the purgatorial fire. Even more frightening was the next group, which earned the longest and most specific description, the army of knights, exercitus militum, dressed all in black and spitting fire. All of them rode on huge horses, carrying various weapons and black standards, as if heading off to battle. And so something that's not captured by Hollywood very often, but is captured by Japanese games of samurai, is that the knights themselves had flags like strapped to their bodies, right? They had like insignia above them. That's why, like in Rome, when you see pictures of soldiers, they've got like the banner or the flag above them saying their name. That was a convention in battle too. It wasn't just the big helmet like the Greeks wore. They had like signs strapped to their backs so that everybody knew who everybody was. And so these guys are on their horses, have their banners strapped to them. Okay. The priest recognized, among others, Richard of Bienfait and Baldwin of Meules, who were the sons of Count Gilbert of Brion, and who were both recently deceased, according to the text, and Landry, Vicomte and Advocate of Orbec, who had died within the year, and who shouted at Walchelin, bidding him to take a message to the Count's wife. But the others told Walchelin not to listen to this liar, a corrupt and merciless parvenu. So even these ghosts are like, that guy was a liar in life. Do not trust him even in death, because the double at this point in the 12th century, the double that remains as a ghost is the same person that was alive at the time. And there's evidence that people didn't believe that you had a developing personality the way we did in Martin Luther, because he talks about how you are who you are when you're born, when you live your life, when you die, and after. That who you are is just who you are. And Martin Luther saw it as God baking that into you when he spat you out the vaginal canal, effectively. Okay, so after several thousand nights had passed, Walchelin realized that he was undoubtedly witnessing Helican's rabble, Familia Herlicini, as what they called it in Latin. He had heard that many people had seen the group, but he had not believed his informants and had even made fun of the people that had seen it. Just like UFO stories today, right? Ghost stories today. People will be like, oh, that's not possible, and then it happens to them, and they're like, oh my God, it happened to me. Now I have authority and have to write about it and take all the credit from the people that told me about it. You see what I'm saying? Walchelin feared he would not be believed, either if he did not bring back some certain proof, certain specimen of his vision. Thus he decided to capture one of the black horses that went by without a rider. The first escaped him. He blocked the path of the second, which stopped as if to allow him to climb on it, and which exhaled from its nostrils a cloud of steam the size of an oak tree. The priest put his foot into the stirrup and took hold of the reins, but he immediately felt an intense burning on his foot, and his hand became indescribably cold. As he let the animal go because of the pain, 4 knights burst forth, accused him of trying to steal their property, and ordered him to follow them. But the 4th rider intervened. He wanted to give Walchelin a message for his wife and son. That is, the knight wanted to give Walchelin a message for the knight's wife and son. Walchelin answered that he did not know the 4th rider. The knight introduced himself. He was William of Glaus, the son of the deceased Barnon of Glaus, the former steward of William of Breteuil, and of the latter's father, the Earl William of Hereford. The principal crime of William of Glaus was usury. That is, I think usury is charging interest on loans. I could be wrong about that. He had William of Glaus had fraudulently acquired and willed to his own heirs a mill that he had held as collateral for a loan that he knew could not be repaid. As punishment, he carried a burning mill shaft in his mouth, heavier than the castle of Rouen, however you pronounce that French town. Walchelin was to go ask his wife Beatrice and his son Roger to help him by restoring the mill to the legitimate heirs, but the priest refused to recognize the dead man. William of Glaus was dead, he said. If he told the son and the widow that he had seen William of Glaus, wouldn't they think him a madman? The dead man then listed the signs that ultimately convinced the priest who had listened to the message he was going who ultimately convinced the priest, who listened to the message he was to convey. But Walchelin had second thoughts. He did not want to be the messenger of a criminal. In a terrible rage, the man took the priest by the neck with a burning hand that left an indelible mark, the signum of the authenticity of the apparition. William let Walchelin go when the priest invoked the Mother of God, and when another knight appeared brandishing a sword and accusing the 4 others of wanting to kill his brother. Doesn't this sound so Hollywood? It's almost tacky. Like, if you just don't believe that this guy saw a ghost, isn't it just like painful how much like Hollywood this is? All that says to me is that somebody in Hollywood once read Orderic Vitalis and once read about this story and once read stories like this, or that there's a common thread. There's something that's happening. The new arrival revealed his identity. He was Walchelin's own brother, Robert, the son of Ralph the Fair. The knight reminded Walchelin of many childhood events they had shared, thus revealing many signa to him. The priest remembered very well, but he refused to admit it. His brother accused him of obstinacy and ingratitude. After the death of their parents, wasn't it Robert who had enabled Walchelin to go to study in France? Walchelin burst into tears and finally agreed to recognize his brother. This story is so human, it's timeless. Like, how many Hammer horror films are about a brother who went to fight in World War I or World War II so that the other brother could go to university? Like, how many American stories are about that re-Vietnam, right? This is a recurring motif in human history. Okay. Walchelin burst into tears and finally agreed to recognize his brother. Robert told Walchelin that because he had sought to steal the property of the dead, res nostra, something no one had ever attempted to do before, which is hard to believe, he would have to share their punishments. But because Walchelin had sung Mass that very day, he would be saved. The convenience here of the crime that no one has ever committed and the get out of jail free card here are less about the superiority of Christianity in the 12th century and more about if there's something happening, if there's a ghost communicating to this guy, it has to both create a prison for him and then it has to get him out of it as well, because he's never engaged with ghosts before. He's never engaged with fairies. This is a time after the fairy mythology that you think was medieval was already ancient. So he doesn't know what to do. And so the ghost has to both give him the dilemma and give him the solution so that he will do what the ghost needs him to do. That's the point that our author is trying to make here. He's not trying to be critical of medieval Christians. Okay. But because Walchelin had sung Mass that very day, he would be saved. The dead man, his brother's punishment consisted of carrying burning weapons that were very heavy. And it's also interesting to me, it's almost kind of silly that like the crimes these guys have to go through, especially if you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, the crimes that these ghosts say they're going through are almost trivial by our standard. Like, okay, you have to carry a 100-pound sword that's also really heavy, but you're also a discorporate entity, so it's hard for me to know whether that's actually difficult for you. It'd be difficult for me, but it makes me think that whatever's happening to them is putting it in terms the people that are experiencing it can understand, which is also what I think is happening in UFO experiences. Okay. Robert told Walshelin, Robert's the ghost, Walshelin is the priest, that the day that Walshelin had been ordained a priest and said his first mass in England, their dead father Ralph had been freed from his torments. It's also funny to me that English people still have these names 1,000 years later. Robert, too, similarly, had been relieved of the shield that had tortured him. He was still carrying his incandescent sword, but hoped to be rid of it within the year. When his brother asked him why his spurs were covered with a mass of congealed blood, the knight answered that it was not blood, but was fire that seemed heavier than the Mont Saint-Michel to him, and that was his punishment for the haste with which he had spilled blood in his lifetime. Finally, forced to end their conversation in order to join the army of the dead, he implored his brother to remember him and to help him, though through prayers and almsgiving, to ensure his release 1 year from the next Palm Sunday. Walshelin, he said, should turn over a new leaf as well, for the priest was to die before long. For 3 days, Walshelin was not to tell anyone what he had seen and heard. On these final words, the knight disappeared. And I don't know, it's not irrelevant to me, but this is so similar. So similar. All of this is so similar to modern stories. And so does that mean that modern people would read stories like this, maybe even this very story, and then just retold it? Totally, it could mean that. The Bell Witch story could be only that, but it could also be something that happened to a family. And because of the education system in the United States in the 1900s, that family was generally educated well enough to be literate enough to write the story down in a way that was able to be published, in a way that only Walshelin and his community has the skill. The cloud above my head looks like a green screen. It's not. I'm sitting out on a patio. There are people walking around giving me ugly looks. Okay. For a week, Walshelin was gravely ill. When he was better, he told his tale to the Bishop Gilbert of Lisieux, who had personally cared for him. Walshelin lived another 15 years or so, which enabled Orderic Vitalis to question him personally and to see the horrible burn mark left by the hand of the dead knight. So Orderic Vitalis, our primary source, interviewed this guy and personally saw the injury on his neck. So many times in the modern world, when a person claims a ghost story and, oh, I've got like this ghostly burn or whatever, they won't actually show it to you. Now, we just have to take Orderic at face value, and we have to believe he's telling the truth, because what does he gain from lying? There's not, in the 12th century, there's not a publishing industry where he gets paid for this. This is just his religious duty as an educated person. Moving on. Orderic says he faithfully transcribed the priest's account for the edification of his readers. He then resumes the tale of the siege of Corcy at the point he had left off. This first written account of Heliquant's hunt has inspired many commentaries. Its insertion in Orderic's chronicle invites us to see it as one of those mirabilia of which the Anglo-Norman clerics were so fond. The very name Heliquant's hunt, the detail of the 4 medlar trees, and the role of the young priest as a messenger of souls sketch the folkloric content of the document. And now, something this book's not about, but something I'm thinking about all the time, is psychopomps. And psychopomps are gods like Hermes, or like I can't remember the name of the one in Egypt, but they're gods who walk with you and effectively educate you on what you're going to need to know as a dead person. So Jesus classifies as a psychopomp, and so this tradition has it. These Christians obviously have a psychopomp, and so it's just interesting that the supernatural, or it's just interesting to me that the supernatural or the afterlife experience keeps representing itself in psychopomps who aren't Jesus, and that's not heretical to these people. I am a psychopomp. I'm a you spelled it wrong, but Yeah, sure. I'm a psycho, and then you could like put a comma there, and then you could call me like punk. You're a psycho, punk. Like, if you're gonna like try to riff on me, be funny. Okay. The very name, Heliquin's Hunt, the detail of the four medlar trees, and the role of the young priest as a messenger of souls sketch the folkloric content of the document. But this text is foremost a product of the scholarly culture of that time. Through its author and its language, through its classic listing of the infernal tortures that are found on the tympanum of Conques, and also through its narrative structure, whose coherence does not appear to me to have been enhanced, even though it reinforces its ideological significance. The me here is, of course, the author. Stryker says, religion had proved itself to be the pinnacle of power and control of the faiths. Okay, yeah, but that's by the 1500s. In the 12th century, Stryker, that's just not true. The Catholic Church was just not the thing you're describing in the 1180s when this book is referring to this story. It's just not true. William the Conqueror wasn't associated at all with the Catholic Church. William the Conqueror didn't get Catholic approval to invade England. William the Conqueror didn't get Catholic approval to disrupt the French or the English thrones. What you're saying is true by the 17th century. The writers either, just because they were the only people who could write in Latin doesn't mean that they were the only people who could communicate. Charlemagne may have been crowned by the Catholic Pope, but Charlemagne got his authority base from non-Christian Frankish under kings or nobles. The people who had power, the writers didn't have power either, because if you wrote something that a powerful noble didn't like, he'd just murder you outright with his bare hands, and there was nothing anybody could do about it, because the way the legal framework worked was that he owed your estate money, and if he was willing to murder you, he was willing to murder your estate if they came calling. This is how wars happened in the 12th century. The church had no power, and the writers had no power, because the people who were making decisions were illiterate in the 12th century. What you're describing is true in the 17th century, but it's not true. It's just not true. They did write fascinating Clive Barker shit, though. That is true, and we can agree about that. Thank you for the commentary. I'm not trying to boss you around. I'm trying to say that the medieval world was very complicated. Yeah, they wrote wild shit, that's for sure. And whether it was real or whether it wasn't real is hard to say, because as an ascetic who is very hungry right now, I decided that what I wanted to do was meditate for a few hours today, and it brought me to a very crazy dream space. I know you're not being critical, and so that's why I say I'm not even being critical of you, Striker. You seem to be female. I don't want to say miss and be wrong and misgender you, but my point is more, yeah, it's to express my love for the material, and that the things that they were thinking about and that they were experiencing while they were awake were very much more like the Army of the Dead than like that show on Netflix about the Pope. I can't remember what it's called. The Borgias. We got to move on though. Okay. So indeed, remarkably, the entire procession of the dead is made up of three large groupings that can easily be connected to the trifunctional schema of the society as had been defined by the clerics of the north of France since the end of the 10th century. And so here's my point. He's actually making your argument. He's allowing you to frame your argument and be right. That's what I was trying to do. He's saying that these writers, they were writing and people were reading them, and they were establishing a university system of information, and that had been going on for about 200 years, but they didn't have the authority to boss people around yet, was all I was trying to say. We agree. Everybody's good. I can be very bossy. But no less remarkably, the three orders here receive unequal treatment, as much in the amplitude of their descriptions as in Walchelin's attitude toward the different types of dead. The first group is the most heterogeneous. They are the dead who belong to the third function, the troop, turba, turma, cohors, agmen. of ordinary folk who are on foot, the simple anonymous men and women, even if they are noble, who were all attached to material possessions to the point of stealing them. And I'm going to take your concur to be that you concur that I can be bossy, and I'm going to laugh at myself. Who were all attached to material possessions to the point of stealing them, to pleasures of the flesh, and to useful objects of daily life, bags, utensils, pots. No mention is made of any communication between these dead and Walshalan, who is content only to recognize some of them. Or content only to recognize some of them. Let's put the emphasis on the right syllable. Next comes the much more coherent but more briefly mentioned group, which corresponds to the first order of society, that of monks and clerics. Their troop, Agman, which is anonymous with 3 possible exceptions, presents the opposite black-clad image of the turba of the blessed and luminous monks who ordinarily appeared within the monastery walls. Even though some of these dead recognize and name Walshalan, he does not communicate with either. He means either of them. Oh, no, he doesn't. I read that sentence backward. He does not communicate with them either. The army of knights, exercitus militum, cohors, agmen, phalanges, is completely different. And so do you kind of hear the English in these Latin words? Phalanges are the bones in your fingers, right? And so these are just different. You don't need to know the different, but like cohort, I don't know what an agmen is, but exercitus sounds like an exercise. Like, I don't know what these words mean either. I'm just asking if you can hear the echoes in English. The knights are a socially homogeneous group, even though a parvenu has slid into its ranks, and homogeneous also in the emblematic signs, horses, weapons, standards, of its function in society. It is the only group that is described as exercitus, a word that appears elsewhere only to designate the whole procession of the dead. And so we kind of understand that. So like the knights kind of represent the whole army, even though we understand there are men-at-arms, foot soldiers, spearmen, these things. Okay. One might even ask whether the expression familia harlecini, the family of Harlequin, might not rather be applied to the whole group by analogy with Robert of Balaam's warrior troop, also called familia, the hunt of knights grouped around their leader. In any event, this group certainly holds the privileged attention of Orderic Vitalis, who simultaneously stresses the knights' crimes and punishments and also the conditions of their redemption. Walshalan communicates only with those among the dead knights who separate themselves from the anonymous troop, but the dialogue does not take shape without difficulty, and on this point the narrative displays a subtle gradation. The Viscount Landry wants very much to assign Walshalan a mission, but Walshalan, who is not of low birth and seems to share the dead knight's prejudices toward this parvenu, does not respond to his entreaties. Thank you for the comment. Oh, cool. Phalanges was a stance in the battalion. Okay, so describing a group of people within the group as phalanges is also, yeah, so it's an organization pattern. We don't need to know the specifics to talk about ghosts, but what we do want to articulate is that Orderic Vitalis, he knew the specifics. And so that's why it's important to keep as many of their words from translating into later words that have different meanings. William of Glaws is no luckier. It's important here that what the author is trying... My table is trying to blow away in the wind. But anyway, it's important to articulate that what the author is trying to articulate here is that Walshalan, because of the social structure of his day, didn't care about the peasants because he may not have even seen the peasants as individuals, and he didn't have to do what the other knights of his rank asked him to do. He could outright refuse to help somebody who was pretending to be a noble person, but somebody above him in rank was able to seize him and force him to help him in the afterlife. And so, continuing in that with that example, William of Glaws is no luckier, for Walshalan is even more evasive with him, and after agreeing to listen to his request, Walshalan breaks all ties with him. The only knight with whom Walshalan ultimately communicates is his own brother, Robert, or Robert, Ties of blood, the duty of a spiritual gift in return for the services rendered by Robert while he was alive, and the proof given showing that masses free the deceased from their torments authorized a relationship of exchange between the dead man and the living one. And I don't really get that. I don't really get how the masses work, but I guess the ghosts come back to say, hey, thank you for the church services. I'm TF out of here. We can thus see the true difficulty of the lesson that Orderic Vitalis assigns to his tale to edify his readers. The endless procession of dead people whom one assumes are heading toward a final punishment, though this is not said explicitly, presents, in accordance with the schema of the three orders, a complete social typology of crimes and punishments on both sides of death. But if there are many dead to implore suffrages from the living, the conditions in which the living can answer them efficaciously are quite limited. The solidarity of natural kinship appears to give some hope of salvation only to a single dead man. Walchelin is solicited by his dead brother in his capacity as a priest, but also and primarily in his position as the dead man's brother, since they had the same father. I'm aware of the country, the landmass India, Legacy Gaming. I don't know that I would say that I have a personal relationship with the landmass or with the nation state, but thank you for the hello. Hello to yourself as well. Sorry. The military part of the troop attracts the most attention due to the social origin of the two main protagonists. More generally, the other accounts we will examine indicate that the troop of the dead is most often an army of the dead, exercitus mortuorum, a sort of infernal double of the feudal army. Even here, Heliquant's hunt echoes the malignant troop of the Lord of Balaam, described in detail by the reformer monk Orderic Vitalis. The fantastic spectacle of the punishments endured by the rapacious, thieving, and murderous knights belongs to the entire apparatus put in place by the church at the time to impose the truce of God and even the peace of God. And here it's important that now I can say that Stryker is totally right to say that Orderic Vitalis was absolutely used to establish the primacy of the church in later eras. So absolutely, that point that the church did have primacy and control over folklore is true. I do want to hammer home. It's 100% absolutely true 500 years after Orderic Vitalis' life. 100% true. That's unarguable. But in his own lifetime, he was contributing to that deliberately, like he was trying to help. Okay. The military part of the troop, nope, we already read that part. The damned knights symbolize a savagery that the church was striving to eradicate or to channel. You see what I'm saying? They were trying to end the bloodshed, and they were doing a bad job. They were doing a terrible job. Yep. PSYOP medieval states is a really good way to think about it, because a lot of what they were doing, especially once you get into the ritual magic of the 15, 16, 1700s, which starts in the 1300s, really not that long after Walchelin and Orderic Vitalis, just really not that long. The ritual magic was decidedly about mind-fucking their towns into being ants, effectively drones. They were trying that. So I just like to make sure that we remember who it was doing it, and that we don't accuse people of thought crimes that they couldn't have committed yet. Okay. I've lost my spot, and that's on me. I'm going to read this sentence again. The damned knights symbolize a savagery that the church was striving to eradicate or to channel, because the crusades haven't happened yet, through institutions of peace, through crusades, through curses and miracles, through the explicitness of the restrictive notion of just war, and with the sanctioning of St. Bernard, through enrollment into the good militia of the military orders. And here's where my pushback, I'm not patting myself on the back. Here's where it's important to understand that things like crusades, the ban on Christians using curses and miracles to judge whether other people are good or bad, and then the notion that we have today that was so popular during 9/11 of a just war, that was not grandfathered into Christianity with Rome. It was something that the Christianity really had to grapple with in order to spark the Crusades. An awareness of the tradition of Heliquant's hunt does indeed throw new light into the famous, this is a title, In Praise of the New Knighthood, which was written between 1129 and 1136. So you see what I'm saying? There's a cultural, psychological shift toward knights who aren't just brutal guys with maces, but are highly intellectual, educated, spiritual, and religious defenders of people of the faith who can't defend themselves. The New Knighthood, in which Bernard of Clairvaux plays on the homophony of the words militia and malitia. The knights of the time he is describing, with their furor, their deadly weapons, their harnesses, their insignia, their taste for women, whom they resemble with their long hair, clearly mirrored the phantoms of Heliquant's hunt. I mean, if you want to come by my tent and return my blow-up doll, that's fine. You have to find my tent, though. Good luck. You and I both know that you don't step outside and touch grass. Anyway, I broke apart that part because the knights of the time that Bernard of Clairvaux is describing, with their furor, their deadly weapons, that passage is important because I'm reading this because on some level I am procrastinating continuing to read Plato's Phaedrus. But this passage is very much what Plato's Phaedrus is about, like men who model themselves after women for potential political and socio-economical gain. And so Bernard of Clairvaux had opinions about that because he read them in Socrates. I mean, it's whatever. RH, you're the one who admits that you use a blow-up doll and that you wanted to borrow another man's used blow-up doll. So, I mean, like, you're the one confessing to embarrassing things and accusing me of things that I just don't care about. So, like, find somebody else to try to trap. So the knights of the time that Bernard of Clairvaux is describing, with their furor, their deadly weapons, their harnessy, their insignia, their taste for women, whom they resemble with their long hair. And if you know anything about the Arthur myths, you know, like, the long hair thing is associated among these knights with connection back to Samson and to other Eddic stories, not to looking like a woman. They're just two things that happen to have it happen at the same time. These things clearly mirrored the phantoms of Heliquant's hunt. Whether they committed a mortal sin by killing someone close to them or whether they themselves died in battle, they were the game of the devil. And that is the evil, lowercase devil. Hey, cool. That, I'm never going to be able to say that. Manilius Astrologica, that's astrology happening in the city of Milan, I'm assuming. I have not read that, but I would be glad to know, like, hit my comments up sometime or message me on my Patreon or something. If you ever make a long form about it, I will listen and I will take notes and I will talk about it with an AI and it will obsess my mind for a month. And so anyway, when the author here is saying that these things that are being associated with Heliquant's hunt are the game of the devil, they're he's being clever. Game doesn't necessarily mean like football. It can also mean like the thing that you're hunting. And so what he's saying is that the devil is the evil. It's not the capital name of evil, but like a kind of amorphous force. Shaggy from Shaggy Dog Story, but I don't mind if you think of me as Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, because ultimately what I am doing is what Shaggy and Scoob were doing, which is getting stoned and investigating historical mysteries. And so, we're going to read this sentence one more time. Whether the damned committed a mortal sin by killing someone close to them, or whether they themselves died in battle, they were the hunt of the devil. You see what I'm saying? They were the game of the devil. Thank you for thinking that's awesome, Unusually Strange. Were they not going to participate in the ride of the damned? They had been hunted down, captured by the devil, and then now was the devil not going to parade them on his sort of triumph? The only way to get rid of these criminals, impeists, people who touch people without consent, and sacrilegious, homicides, perjurers, adulterers, and to enable them at the same time to bring about their own salvation was to enroll them among the Knights Templar, forced into monastic discipline, with shaved heads, without women, and without the fallacious pleasures of the hunt. Undoubtedly, in the 12th century, there was a relationship between the increasing prevalence of the furious army of the dead and all the contemporary measures being taken to rein in the feudal system and to limit its wars and devastations. I don't think that God is going to listen to my prayers for Oklahoma, but I thought that Oklahoma was the place to be. I don't believe that people are fighting in the streets, but if they are, you have my condolences. I just haven't heard of such a thing. I'm in Ohio, and I'm not rich enough to help, so I'm sorry for that. Okay, so now we're on to the next subchapter within this chapter, titled "How Ancient is the Wild Hunt?" Most historians and folklorists who have charted the tradition of Heliquant's hunt and the wild hunt up through contemporary folklore have insisted on its very long history. In the military character of this collective apparition and in the mythical figure of its leader, Heliquant, scholars have wanted to find a relic of the second Indo-European function or even an echo of the juvenile and warring associations. This is a German word, I don't know, Mannerbunde or Mannerbunde, that the ancient Germans were thought to have known. I don't know what a Mannerbunde is, but I do know that people who want to make an Indo-European connection to all of these things, they tend to be wrong, and so that's why our author is only summarizing them rather than offering them in detail. They tend to be very wrong, and it's so funny. It was so warm in my tent because my tent is in the direct sunlight, and I am sitting in just enough shade to be chilly. So we're going to pull out my blue thing and look like I'm draping myself in a ritual garb of some sort. The earliest mention of Heliquant's hunt is a rather obscure allusion made by Tacitus in the Germania concerning the Harii who fought at night while taking on the appearance of an army of ghosts. During the early Middle Ages, the harvest remained thin. In the 7th century, this is the 600s AD, a Greek author, Damascius of Damascus, his name is Damascus, from Damascus. It must be really easy to know where that guy was born. Cigarette filter. I don't smoke cigarettes anymore, but hey, I don't know what a 3.5 is, but thank you for the manifesting me things. I suggest, however, that if you're going to do that, you spell manifest with an I rather than 2 A's. It's man-I-fest, Mani-fest. And I don't know if it has to do with the ancient guy of Manichaeanism, Mani, but I bet it does. Highly recommend Tacitus and Germanicus or whatever it's called. I haven't read it. Germania. I haven't read it, but I highly recommend it. Everybody who cares about this stuff as a scholar always recommends Tacitus, and Julius Caesar also wrote about the Germans. Hey! Yeah, if your past manifestations weren't working, it's because you were spelling your spell wrong, bud. You got to spell your words properly in order for the spell to work. It's the same word. During the early Middle Ages, the harvest remained thin. In the 7th century, a Greek author, Damascus of Damascus, asserted that at the time of the siege of Rome by Attila, 2 centuries earlier, the spirits of the dead warriors, or rather the images of their souls, translated here, I am never going to be able to say this, Eidkla Tkun, that's TCN, that's not a word I can pronounce, Tkun Sukhan, which means images of their souls, and here Suki doesn't actually mean soul, Suki means the images of their spirits, or their the breath of life within them, continued to fight. So this guy, Damascus of Damascus, is telling us that 2 centuries early, when Rome was attacked by the forces, the Huns of Attila, that for 3 days and 3 nights after the fighting was done, the images of their souls, invisible versions of them, continued to fight outside the walls of Rome with even more ardor than did the living men. In the West, St. Augustine, in the City of God, described the confrontation of 2 armies of demons that left an accumulation of bodies and horses on the battlefield, a presage to the battle that men were soon to wage. A few centuries later, in the history of the Lombards, Paul the Deacon, circa 720 to 787 is his lived time, recorded the reports at the time of the plague of Justinian in the 5th century, that is the 400s AD, of the murmur of an army heard accompanying the scourge. And if I'm not wrong, that Justinian was also the last pagan emperor, and so that's probably what John the Deacon was blaming that stir on. Once again, the year 1000 marked a turning point. Accounts continued to establish a link between these apparitions and the real wars of the living, or to associate the troop of the dead with that of evil spirits. But the accounts were much more abundant and richer than before. Several types of apparitions were combined. Sometimes there was a sort of procession of the penitent dead, an army of pitiful shadows that raised its lamentations and begged for prayers. Sometimes, more fearful, the furious army traveled through the air in the din of weapons, and that means in the din means with the din surrounding it. The din of weapons, I've lost my spot. Horses and dogs. The same author, Raoul Glauber, mentions them in succession. Another, and a miracle of Saint Foy of Celestat, manages to connect them. And often, the army of the dead is not described explicitly, but is evoked only in the background of an individual apparition. It was not rare for a dead individual to separate from the troop of the dead, as was seen in the tale of Orderic Vitalis, in order to carry on a dialogue alone with the beneficiary of the apparition. Let us now examine these accounts. Okay, so, yeah, it would have sucked to live during any plague era, I agree. Before the 21st century. Before I move on to the next subchapter, I want to dwell on that what he's trying to articulate here isn't specific stories, and the reason he moves so quickly is because he's articulating that we have written accounts that other people have studied very well, and that he's not going to go into in this book, spanning the 500 years between when Orderic Vitalis called it Heliquin's Hunt, and other people describing similar things. We have 500 years of scholarship and source materials, as all that little subchapter was about. And so now we move on to the elect and the damned. Okay, elect in this language, if you didn't grow up in an old-timey church, elect means it means people who are better than normal people, and they're raised above normal people. And so when you elect someone for office, you raise them above normal people into a quasi-religious position within the United States, right? When you elect somebody to a public office. Yeah, I don't need to explain that a third time. Moving on. The elect and the damned. Raoul Glauber began writing his... I am certain I'm pronouncing his name wrong, by the way. Raoul Glauber began writing his Historie at the Abbey of Saint Benign of Dijon in 1028, and continued writing it until just before his death at Cluny in 1049. Convenient that he died right before it ended. The entire work is filled with tales of wonders, demoniacal or celestial apparitions, and descriptions of collective disasters, famine, incursions of the Saracen, and in which historians of the Romantic period heard the echo of the terrors of the year 1000, compensated by the fully hopeful image of a Christendom covering itself with a, quote, white mantle of churches. In those troubled times, at dawn on the Sunday of the octave of Pentecost, that's Trinity Sunday, after lauds, we read that Volfurius, who was a monk of the Diocese of Langres and was a doctor in his monastery, suddenly sees the church where he is praying alone, filled with a procession of serious men wearing white robes and purple stoles. Serious here means kind of that face I just made. It means not necessarily stoic and unfeeling, but it definitely means severe. It means quiet. It means that. It means not having an expressive face. Okay. The one who's leading them, carrying a cross in his hands, claims to be the bishop of many peoples, multarum plebeium. These men say that during the night, unbeknownst to the monks, they attended matins and lauds. The bishop immediately begins to celebrate Trinity Mass on the altar of the martyr Saint Maurice. Answering the monks' questions, the dead men reveal that they are Christians, killed by the Saracens in the defense of their faith. And now he's using the word Saracen, and I don't know if he's using the French term Saracen, which means Muslim, or if he means the people in, I think the Saracens were themselves in North Africa. Whether he means the specifically Saracen people, I can't know because he doesn't define. And back in the time here, they wouldn't have defined either. So that might be why our author is using the antique term for Muslims, Saracens, because they were, well, like for a long time, Muslims called all Christians French because those were just the people they were used to dealing with. Through their deaths, continuing on, they merited the place of the blessed. These people who are these dead who are visiting this church, traveling through Volfurius's region, where other men are to join them, they are headed toward this place. When Mass is finished, the bishop gives the kiss of peace to his assistants and gestures to the monk to follow him. And since they all immediately disappear, Volfurius understands that he will not live for long, which was in fact what occurred. 5 months later, in December, Volfurius goes to Auxerre to take care of some monks who are ill. He wants to see the patients the very evening he arrives, but the other monks insist that he wait until the next day. Soon, his death throes begin, punctuated by 2 visions of the Virgin, who confirms that he has received the grace to see what few men have seen, and that consequently he must die. Must there is intense, man. Imagine finally having the beatific vision you've worked on your whole life as a Christian, and then God saying, yep, and now you gotta die, horribly and in pain. Well, it's not funny, but it is kind of funny. It's kind of funny that people did this on purpose. Like they sought this out on purpose, knowing that they would die. Knowing that they would die in horrible pain, the way Volfurius is. Soon, his death throes begin, punctuated by 2 visions of the Virgin, who confirms that he has received the grace to see what few men have seen, and that consequently he must die. But she grants him her protection in this trial. Indeed, on the 3rd night, the bells announce the death of Volfurius, while devils attempt in vain to take his soul. Being French, this guy is using devil and demon and other things. He just means like evil entities. I agree, Striker. Somebody really does need to mine this for a trilogy. Like what Paramount, I think, wanted to do that, like that monster universe, like their Marvel universe, but monsters. Yeah, I would love it if somebody, like, there's that Netflix show, Warrior Nun. I would love it if Warrior Nun were also Clash of the Titans. You see what I'm saying? That'd be so cool. Maybe it's just something that I have to do someday. In Book 5, Raoul Glauber describes once again repeated apparitions of demons and other wonders that do not leave much hope for the survival of those who have witnessed them. He takes a local example that he dates around 25 years before the time he is writing. Near Tonnerre, the priest Fratarius, one Sunday after dinner, looks out his window and sees an army of men on horseback going off to battle. And this is said in Latin. I cannot read Latin. Acies equitum veluti in praelium purgentes. Coming from the north and heading west. He calls them in vain to ask them for some explanation. His very voice seems to speed up their disappearance, and he is seized by such terror that he cannot contain his tears. This, man, I have listened to so many ghost stories. I used to love them, and it's something that podcasts provided a lot of until about, 2019. And I have just listened to so many ghost stories, and this is just what happens. This is what happens in ghost stories. And does that mean that modern ghost stories, people claiming to have had experiences, are borrowing on this tradition because they've read these books? Very unlikely, in my opinion. Very unlikely. But it's not impossible. Like I said, the United States is uniquely literate among historical places, worlds, and the idiom of historical people. Okay. I don't even remember what I was talking about, what I was reading. So I'm just going to move to the next paragraph and hope I'm right. These two tales of collective apparitions contrast almost term to term. In the first, the dead are blessed, former religious figures who, in spite of themselves, battled infidels and underwent martyrdom. This is why they are associated with Saint Maurice, a soldier and martyr. In the second tale, the dead are knights who are going into battle. They come from the north, which is not a good omen, and travel quickly outside and not within the consecrated place of the church. And what I would love to do is explain to you why coming from the north isn't a good omen, but like the cold comes from up there. I don't know why either. And it's a total diversion, so he can't explain it. Far from explaining their condition, they refuse all communication with the living man who calls to them. They form an army of the damned. There is, however, a common trait between those two collective apparitions. The first follows the massacre brought about by the Saracen incursions, and the second announces the massacres that will be caused by the invasion of the Capetians. I don't know who the Capetians are, but I can only assume they're in the north. The accounts represent two extreme poles of war. Actually, I think the Capetians are... isn't that Philip Augustus's family? Somebody who knows the history of France better than I do, tell me, aren't the Capetians... they're a super famous family in French feudalism, right? On the one end, the war for one's faith, which led to martyrdom and was concretely accomplished in the Crusades. And on the other end, the bloody war that Christians waged among themselves at the risk of being damned. War was a sign in which the past and the future, terrestrial life and salvation, history and eschatology were all connected. And if you don't know, eschatology or eschatology is the study of the end of all things, the end of time. And opening into the aftermath, the apparition revealed the symbolic meanings of the event, an obstacle to the political project of the chronicler, the establishment of the Pax Christiana. That's really weird to read in Latin, Christiana. The Christian peace is what Pax Christiana means. War, the just and the unjust, was mentioned by these authors by means of the vision for the values of war and of peace, depending on the transcendent meaning of history as Raoul Glaber understood it. Next chapter section. Tainted souls. Between 1108 and 1138, or 1155 at the earliest, the tale of an apparition in Alsace, an apparition of two different troops of dead, was added to a manuscript of the Book of Miracles of Saint Foy of Conques, which had been undertaken at the beginning of the 11th century. My voice always gets excited, and my face probably does, when I read towns that I know. I know I'm saying Alsace, right? God, I'm so dumb. This apparition concerns the monastery of Saint Foy of Celestat, which originally had ties with the distant abbey of, I know I'm not going to say this right, Rouergue. That word is almost all vowels. Rouergue. I'm sorry, French people. I can't pronounce that. This tale might be considered the myth of the origin of a title of donation that, in 1095, established the land wealth of the Alsatian monastery. We can easily understand why the monks wrote down and divulged this myth, which gave their community an illustrious origin and guaranteed it protections in the future. And he's making a good point. We can understand, and he's using myth in air quotes, because myth just means any narrative story in the language of these people, in the Greek language. Myth just means a narrative story with a plot. We, in the modern times, we apply the that explains a phenomenon definition of myth. And so I do like what he's saying here enough. I want to say it a second time. We can easily understand why the monks wrote down and divulged this narrative story that has a plot, which gave their community an illustrious origin and guaranteed it protections in the future. What he's saying is that the myth didn't guarantee the protections, but that they were guaranteed protections, and that the myth was beneficial in making those things happen and bridging that gap and communicating why this monastery and the community that fed it were valuable to the world of Alsace outside this specific monastery. But the tale's function did not stop there, since the story also concerns the ascent of the Hohenstaufen family to the imperial throne. I don't know who that family is. If you do, tell me about it in the comments. That'd be cool. As often happened, for example, as in the tales of Peter the Venerable, the ghost tale was the crossroads of various interests, both lay and ecclesiastical. The monastery's powerful protectors who intervene in the tale are four brothers of high nobility. Frederick of Buren, 1079 to 1105 are his dates. That's 26 years. The Duke of Swabia and the son-in-law of the Emperor Henry IV. The Bishop of Strasbourg, Otto, died 1100. Another brother, Walter. There are a lot of Walters in this book coming up. A confusion of Walters, you could say. And finally, the Count Conrad, who died in 1094. When Frederick, Otto, and Conrad go on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, is the setup to a medieval bar joke, they stop at Conques, where they are welcomed into the fraternity and the participation of all the spiritual goods of the monks. The monks pray for their noble visitors, who in turn generously repay the monastery. Once back home, the three brothers decide to bequeath to Conques. I think I'm saying that name right. I'm probably not. It's probably Conques. The church that they themselves and their mother, the Countess Hildegard, had recently built in 1087 in honor of the Holy Sepulchre. At the request of the founders, the abbot of Conques, Bego, 1087 to 1108, that's 21 years, sends a monk by the name of Bertramnus to Alsace to establish the new community. France, I'm sorry for making fun of you. A second monk, Stephen, soon joins him, but for more than 2 years in an empty monastery, the monks know only hunger, thirst, and cold, to the point of wanting to abandon everything and return to Conques. It is then that the miracle takes place, through the intercession of Saint-Foy, to whom reversals of fortune were familiar. Within the logic of the tale, the apparition probably occurred in 1094-95 after the death of the Countess Hildegard and her son, the Count Conrad, but before 1095, the date of the title of the surviving brothers' donation benefiting the monastery. This is confusing and seems twisted and convoluted and like it super doesn't matter, but I want to talk about how we can relate this, like, between us to the modern world. Like, there are so many ghost stories. I'm even thinking about how there's a ghost story that contextualizes and sets up the story for the Conjuring movies, the books that became the Conjuring movie, the House of Light, House of Dark series, I think is what those are called. There's even a story about two guys who died huddled and frozen in a blacksmith shop in the town that this story takes place in. So, like, this thing, people dying on pilgrimage and dying young, going on pilgrimage like in the Canterbury Tales was dangerous. It was very dangerous. Life in 1100. Like this guy, Bego, he died at 21 on a religious pilgrimage. He wasn't sick. He was a noble person going on pilgrimage to see a holy site, and he died along the way. Like, that's a big deal. And so one can almost assume that somebody who dies on pilgrimage is going to leave a kind of white lady ghost, can't we? I think that's what our author is trying to establish. That it's not so much the donations that are being made in the names of these people for having died in these churches. It's the idea that if you don't put, like, the silver in the mouth of the dead person, they won't be able to afford to pay Charon to go to Styx. And so if these monastic communities don't exist, there's nowhere for anyone to go on pilgrimage, but more importantly, there's nowhere for ghosts to finish their pilgrimage. People who die on pilgrimage to arrive to finish so that they can complete the thing that they died doing. You understand what I'm saying? Like, the modern folklore of ghosts, and I'm sorry that I'm frowning. Sorry I appear to be frowning. I'm passionate, but I'm not angry at you. Modern ghost folklore, like haunted hotels, to me are a kind of sadness, because the people trapped there are trapped. If they're residual hauntings, that kind of makes it, oh, okay, well, that's not sad for them. But if they're intelligent hauntings, they need someone to send them to the other way, because they died in a hotel before they got to wherever they were going. You understand what I'm saying? Before they got to a permanent resting place. So churches in the Middle Ages, he said earlier in an earlier chapter that Christianity was concerned with making a white blanket of churches across Europe. And the reason they did that is because in the era that we're talking about, and especially earlier than the era we're talking about, they were very concerned with making sure that people who died going between towns, that people died of who died of illness, that people who died in their beds at night, people who died in the cold, people who died in war, people who died along the road because they were robbed, people who were murdered, that people who died with unresolved conflicts in life could resolve those conflicts in death at churches. They were very concerned with this. And so I know that people are dropping out of this because it's less interesting than the reading itself, but I just want to bring that home in as human a way as I possibly can. These people were very concerned with leaving things unfinished. They were very concerned with making sure that your life at any given moment was a neatly tied up bow. Okay. A knight by the name of Walter of Diabolization, a former vassal of Count Conrad's, often did penance at night outside the monastery, wearing a hair shirt, and no shoes. Hair shirts are uncomfortable. They're a sign of penance. While the monks sang matins inside the church, one night, Walter of Diabolization is pulled out of his prayers by the vision of two different groups of figures. In a courtyard composed of cloisters and the workshops of the monastery, he sees a large group of pilgrims arrive dressed in white and holding a bell and a sack. On the public road that passed below the monastery, he sees a crowd of riders whose horses and clothing are entirely red. Assuming that the first group, the whites, are true pilgrims, he shows them the entrance to the monastery, and one of them calls him by name. A direct dialogue begins. Walter asks the white one who he is to dare to give the knight an order. Even priests. This is why I pushed back on Stryker. And Stryker, if you're still here, thank you for still being here. But this is why I pushed back on you so hard. Even priests back then weren't allowed to tell knights what to do. So the authority they had, the literary authority that they had, was only one pillar of the authority that was wielded at the time. Walter asks the white one who he is to dare to give the knight an order. The other answer that he is Walter's dead master, the Count Conrad. And so it's interesting that these ghosts, even when you can see them, you can communicate with them, don't always look like what the living people remembered. Conrad reminds the knight how, when Conrad was alive, he favored Walter more than all his other vassals with his kindness. The vassalage thing is a kind of like it's slavery. Like, it was a different kind. It's social slavery, but it's slavery. So like favoring your vassals is not like favoring your employees. It's not like giving a guy a higher raise. It's like that guy gets access to like better women. Ultimately, is what favoring a vassal means. Stupefied, Walter drops to the ground. Then the dead man reassures the knight and gives Walter the proof, signum, that he is not a phantasma. That means not a figment of his imagination or a demon that can grab and hurt him, and that he is talking to his vassal with God's permission. The proof is the common memory of a hunt in winter. This signum also enables Walter to be believed by Conrad's three brothers. By virtue of his vassalic oath, per fide sacramentum, and in exchange for the past good deeds of his lord, the knight must in fact accept the mission that the dead man assigns him with regard to the brothers. Do you understand here that this relationship, even this ghost relationship, is showing that even this dead guy gets to tell this living guy what to do, and the living guy gets no opinion in the matter. He has to do what he's talking about. So when you hear 20th century people make the I was just doing what I was told, I was just following orders excuse, they are full of shit. Because this is different. Like, nobody went to hell and advocated in the afterlife for Hitler. You see what I'm saying? But these people did. They went and advocated for people after those people had died that they needed to get out of hell because they weren't the kind of person who belonged in hell. That's what this ghost Conrad is asking this living knight Walter to do. And he has the authority to do it because he's, even though he's dead, Walter's ghost is bonded to do what this guy's ghost says to do because of the per fidei sacramentum, your sacred fidelity to me. It's a big deal. This is like magic stuff binding these people in the feudal world. And so misunderstanding that, it doesn't put you at risk of anything other than misrepresenting a people. And we, being liberally educated modern people, we don't want to misrepresent anybody for any reason. We understand that that's a kind of racial superiority. You see what I'm saying? Moving on. Death does not end vassalic obligations. The living vassal must continue to obey the orders of his dead master and lend assistance, if only through his prayers, even if just thinking nice thoughts. He has no choice but to even think nice thoughts and to ask for good things for this guy because of the religious and magic ritual he went through. Walter must ask the Bishop Otto of Strasbourg, whose prayers and almsgiving will give Conrad in the hereafter, to give Conrad's share of his inheritance to Saint-Foy. The recollection in the guise of signa of two memories will convince the bishop that Walter is not lying, and a prediction is added to these proofs. Before dying, the bishop will complete a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and will return after 2 years. If between now and then he has given the monastery the property that Conrad wants him to, Walter will die in a state of grace. Otherwise, Walter might well leave this world sooner than anticipated. We know that Otto in fact participated in the First Crusade at the call of Pope Urban II, and that he died shortly afterward in 1100. Walter must also warn another brother, whose name is also Walter. You could be a mother and name both of your sons Walter. Against his taste for clothes, horses, and costly weapons. Of all the brothers, Walter B. might well be the first to follow Conrad into death, and he must be prepared for it. We know that Walter B. died before 1105. Most importantly, the knight Walter A., was to find the third brother, the Duke Frederick. For all of the brothers, he would survive and would be the sole heir. Superstitum et heredum of the lineage, familia. And so the point here is that this ghost is telling this living person, hey, so you and your brothers, there are 4 of you, 3 of you are going to die in the next 5 years. Find the one that's going to survive and make sure that all of your family inheritance go to that guy, or it's going to the state of France. Most important, I read that sentence already, sorry. Walter was to remind Frederick, he uses a lot of pronouns, him, he's, and doesn't define them. So Walter was to remind Frederick that at the moment Walter entered into the court of the emperor with his brother Conrad, the 2 brothers had told each other a secret known only to them. And Walter was to transmit the following prediction to Frederick. His lineage, progenies, was the richest and was destined for glory. His descendants would become kings of the Romans and emperors. We know that, in fact, a son of Frederick of Buren, Conrad III, in 1138, became the first king of the Staufen dynasty, and that the nephew of Conrad III, Frederick III of Swabia, became king in 1152 and acceded to the empire in 1155 under the name of Frederick I Barbarossa. And so if you've ever heard of Frederick I Barbarossa, you've heard of a very famous person who evidently had a ghost in real time verifiably predict his reign. That's fucking cool. But Conrad specified the conditions under which this dynastic destiny was going to be accomplished. Frederick, not Frederick I Barbarossa, but the Frederick brother of Walter, was to protect the Church of Saint-Foy, which he had founded with his brothers, and guarantee its freedom from the state of France. By giving the church the brothers' common property, commune pretium, Frederick would ensure the future of his lineage and would simultaneously enable his dead brother to avoid hell. Before following the orders of his lord, Walter wanted to know more about the whites and the reds. Conrad continues, "The whites are the souls of those who lived chastely and did penance for their crimes on earth. They went in pilgrimage into the house of Saint-Foy and earned her help through the gifts they offered her." This is important. They paid penance for their crimes. What that means is that when they did something they knew that was bad, or that they learned was bad, they paid an appropriate penance. Whether that means they said the right prayers, or they made the right apologies, or they paid the right debts. Whatever the thing was, there were systems in place that these people got to die without people thinking they were shitbags. That's kind of the difference in heaven and hell here. And then, as he's going to explore, purgatory is like, you thought you weren't a shitbag, but it turns out God is pretty ticky-tack. Okay. These brothers have escaped the tortures of hell, but they do not yet enjoy eternal rest. The brothers are moving toward perfect happiness, led by Saint-Foy. Conrad shows Walter the luminous outline of Saint-Foy, leaning on the entrance to the monastery, which the whites are preparing to enter. The reds, destined on the contrary to the infernal flames, are those people who disregarded divine and human laws and died in battle or without having done penance. The dying in battle without having done penance thing is a big deal, because for thousands of years we've gone into battle assuming that God is going to protect us because individually we were touched by a priest or a shaman that told us that God was going to protect us. So that the Christian priest just picked this tradition up, and now that they're doing it and people are dying and some of them are coming back as ghosts, they have to explain that, like, well, either the penance wasn't good, the priest wasn't good, or these people didn't seek penances. And what the science, these gathered mirabilia stories seem to be telling us is that these people coming back are saying, yep, I just didn't seek penance, that's why I didn't make it across. All of my friends made it across because they sought penance. If Conrad had not benefited from the help that Saint-Foy lavished on him in exchange for the benefit of that church, he would not be following the whites, but would be in torture with the reds. The reds are going as far as Novellus and the mountain of hell. Immediately afterward, the dead man disappears. Left alone, Walter marks with 2 stones the place where Conrad appeared to him. But since he tells no one where those stones are located, no one knows where the apparition occurred. Didn't the narrator, a monk, fear some act of necromancy in this place? Shortly afterward, the surviving brothers meet to divide up their inheritance. The monks, who still know nothing about the apparition, are ready to be satisfied with a mill, garden, field, and a small woods. These are all places that generate income for the person who owns them. So like if you own a wood, what you don't want to do is cut it down for the lumber. What you want to do is sell rights to hunt for deer and other livestock, mushrooms, things in it. It can be very, even just a forest itself, even just selling scavenge wood could be very, very profitable. I'm trying to remember where my place was, and I am sorry for that. Each of the brothers is already receiving the oaths of fidelity from the knights and peasants who belong to his share. When the knight Walter comes to find each one separately to inform him of the apparition of his brother, as well as of the proofs and predictions that concern him, immediately recognizing the signs and crying over their dead brother, the brothers put all their property back together and give all the land and men pretium et homines to Saint-Foy for the salvation of the souls of their brother and of their ancestors, and for the redemption of their own souls. Thus, the monks did not receive the meager share that was at first intended for them, but thanks to the miraculous intervention of Saint-Foy, they became rich and possessed everything. Doesn't this sound very much like the story of Job? Like, if you just apologize, just tell God you're sorry, and he'll give you riches. And they're not even leaning on the story of Job here. They're just saying that these people said sorry, did penance, and then got rich. But doesn't that make sense? Not even from a medieval market standpoint. Doesn't it make sense that, like, say Jeff Bezos did something horrible? Wouldn't we continue to use Amazon if all he did was say sorry? Okay. I don't know this word, but the Cartulary of Conques contains the title of donation, dated July 23rd, 1095, which lists all the property left to the monks and mentions among the reasons for the action the death of Conrad and his mother. To ensure the individual salvation of a dead man, to justify retrospectively the ascent of a dynasty, and to legitimize the material protection owed a church, these were the three tightly overlapping functions of this tale, which, with the help of a myth, expounds an older deed dating from decades earlier. Equally important is the use this unique tale makes of images that were widespread in other places. For example, the structural contrast by social type, clothing, color, place, and destination of two different groups of dead people, those who will surely be damned and those who, like Conrad, are the elect in power. Power here being like, you know how we sometimes will say like rest in power instead of rest in peace? Like that kind of power. Not power like to, like we use power when we talk about a government, but power like glory, right? The temperature out here keeps fluctuating wildly. Okay. Moving on from that and remembering where I found... Like the tale of Raoul Glauber a century earlier, this story depicts the imposed collective division of souls right after death, but here the division is less radical. It does not entirely anticipate that of the Last Judgment, the eschatological end, since the white salvation, even if ensured, is not yet completely achieved. Nor is a collective division exactly the same as the individual judgment that decides the fate of each soul at the moment of death. One might say of the whites, like Conrad, that they are going through a sort of strange purgatory, both itinerant and without trials, quite different from the fixed and closed place of tortures that would dominate ideas of purgatory at the end of the century. An analogous distinction between two troops of dead, the Reds and the Whites, is found at the beginning of the 13th century in the work of Gervais of Tilbury, or Gervais, I don't know whether that's an English or a French name. And the Bishopric of Turin was an abbey that sheltered the relics of St. Constantine and the martyrs of the Theban Legion. Undoubtedly, Gervais is speaking of St. Maurice. In the shadow of a mountain every year on the saint's feast day, pilgrims witness the appearance of a double procession of figures, some dressed all in white and others all in red. If a pilgrim climbed the mountain, the vision disappeared. In the most ancient classifications of colors, red and white, along with black, play a fundamental role. But the symbolism of colors, subject to interpretations that have varied throughout history, does not follow an immutable code. Here, these two colors most likely designate two types of saints and not the damned. The martyrs are in red. Other contemporary tales speak only of a single troop of dead, sometimes in a positive light, but most often negatively. The criteria of the division are openly ideological. The cohort of saintly monks is contrasted with the furious army of pillaging knights. And I just want to say it's important here that in psychedelic and alternative religious circles, what he's saying here is that the use of red, white, black, maybe yellow, maybe blue, these are not linked to the fundamental psychedelic states or meditative trance states where white, black, and red, yellow, and sometimes blue or green are fundamental. They're fundamental, okay? I've never done it. I've done it very rarely. When you have extreme visionary psychedelic experiences, you tend to see things in glowing reds, yellows, blacks, whites, sometimes blues and greens. And what he's saying is that although these are religious and psychedelic maybe, states that these people are experiencing, the use and the experience of these colors, particularly red, maybe yellow, purple, maybe blue, and black, are about the available dye that they had. It's not about psychedelic states, is what he's arguing. I don't know if he's right or not, but I think that that's a caution that he and any audience of this work should keep in mind. And that does end that subchapter. So we are in the next subchapter, which is titled "The Procession of the Elect, the Ride of the Damned." It is important that there is already baked into Christianity the imagery of Jesus riding that donkey, right? And the procession that would have come along with that. But the stories that are coming up in this part, I don't know. It's hard to explain. There are going to be people riding on animals, and he's not going to explain what the animals mean. He's going to explain that they mean something to them. But I think the riding on animals thing predates Jesus by a minute. Like, that he rode on a donkey is a thing, but like there are people riding on like goats and pigs and things you would never ride on. And so like I'm thinking of, is it the Black Cauldron movie and book where the little fae people ride on animals? Moving on, because I don't actually know what the fuck I'm talking about. It's just it's an image that's in here that I recognize else places that I have never heard anybody explain. So if you know what's going on or you know where I can find it, that's what that comment section in the chat are for. And hey, thank you for stop trying to troll me in the chat, and thank you for 9 likes is a shitload for me. Thank you for that. Moving on with the procession of the elect, the ride of the damned. The apparition of the troop of the elect was related most often in monastic tales. The blessed who appeared were monks, and they appeared to other monks to assure the living of their happiness and to warn against infractions of the monastic rule. It's interesting to me, and I know I'm breaking away too early, but the way monks are portrayed, especially like in Hollywood or television, is like stodgy old bastards. But this story, I mean, they're just sitting around telling funny ghost stories, is what they're actually doing in those monasteries. Mirrors of the monks, these texts had the function of self-justification. This explains, that's probably what the mirabilia means, is mirror. Anyway, these texts had the function of self-justification. This explains their place in monastic hagiography, I don't know what that word means, and miracula. For example, at the beginning of the 12th century in the life of Bernard of Tiron, the prior of Saint-Savin, and I think that's Poitou, and the church of that monastery, where he prays alone at night, he sees a multitude of monks white as snow, who gather at a church where he joins. One of the dead, who is the leader of the others, informs him that 19 monks of the community are going to have to die, and that they must prepare themselves for this. Bernard goes to warn them, and tells one of them, who assumes Bernard simply had a bad dream, that he will be the first to die, which does in fact happen, and thus proves the truth of the apparition. It's important here if you're skeptical. The author is not saying that this proves the truth of the apparition in the author's mind, or that it should prove the truth in your mind. He's saying that it, Jean-Claude Schmidt is saying that in the mind of the prior of Saint-Savin, this is proof. The last of the miracula of Marmoutier, dated from 1137, is comparable. Having only recently become a monk, the former archdeacon of Clermont sees, appearing before him in the church during the night of the Feast of All Saints, the 3 patron saints of the monastery, Martin, Fulgentius, and Corentin, as well as a procession of dead monks. Sorry, I let myself get distracted. I actually need to look at my phone's battery. I have 64%, but I can disconnect this, so give me just a second. I am sorry, this is unprofessional. I'm not getting paid to do this. I didn't put my hand over the phone, so that is at least an improvement. As well as a procession of dead monks arranged according to the chronological order of their deaths. The monk recognizes some of them. The dead sing hymns for the dead with him, then tell him of the coming death of the abbot Odo. The monk hastens to awaken the other monks, notably Garnier, who will succeed Odo, that's O-D-O, not O-T-T-O, and some of them hear and see the procession before it disappears. It might actually be pronounced Otto. In contrast, most tales depict the ride of a troop of the future damned. At the beginning of the 12th century, Orderic Vitalis' account of Harlequin's hunt was far from unique. Remember, we are still talking about Harlequin and Harlequin's hunt. Although initially the army of the dead generally did not have a specific name, at the end of the century this was no longer true. Often this army was evoked only briefly in reference to the misfortunes of the century or to the traps of the devil, lowercase d, or in comparison with other wonders. When the army of the dead was mentioned for itself, it was the object of more circumstantial descriptions. Very quickly, it also became a literary theme, which means that people were telling fiction. They were using literary stories and using the character in fiction. Paradoxically, the literary form of the most ancient tale, even older by a few years than Orderic Vitalis' account, is undoubtedly the farthest from the written forms of a tradition passed on orally. It indeed belongs to the genre of mirabilia, but to those that derive their subjects from the mythology of the ancients as much as from the traditions of folklore. Around 1125, William of Malmesbury used those traditions in the guise of an ancient fable. He included in his Gesta Regum Anglorum, I don't know what Gesta means, but Regum Anglorum means kings of England, the most ancient version known of the tale titled The Venus de Ile, since made famous by Mary May's story, which he strangely links to an apparition of the troop of the dead. The story is supposed to take place in ancient Rome. During a ball game, a young groom places his wedding ring on the finger of a statue of Venus. And I do want to say, just between you and me, I think it's very funny. I'm not being anti-soccer, but the ball game they're playing here is actually more like American football than soccer. But the goddess keeps the ring and prevents the young man from consummating his marriage. Following the advice of a necromancer priest Palumbus, the young man goes to a crossroads where he witnesses the heterogeneous procession of a troop of horsemen and foot soldiers led by Venus, who is riding a mule and dressed to look like a prostitute. And so when I mention Jesus riding a mule, I'm trying really hard not to wonder whether there were Calendamaggio, look it up, stories, not stories, but rituals of Venus is the morning star. That's Aphrodite and Inanna, Ishtar, all of these goddesses. And the prostitute on the donkey. I just wonder about Jesus and Andromeda, because it's not like Jesus appeared divorced from these traditions, these myths. You see what I'm saying? It doesn't mean anything, but I'm going to read this again. Following the advice of a necromancer priest, Palumbus, the young man, goes to a crossroads. And so a crossroads can be... Shit. The crossroads can be a quadrivium, right? Can you see that? Right? Four-way? It can be a quadrivium, or it can be a trivium, a three-way. Does that make sense how I drew that out? And so if you're familiar with like rock and roll or blues, right, going to the crossroads to meet the devil, this necromancer in this story... Okay, so this story is written 1125, right? And he's creating an ancient fable to have this person go to the crossroads and meet Venus. And so that wouldn't be unlike going to the crossroads in the United States to meet the devil. And Venus is Aphrodite, is riding a mule and dressed to look like a prostitute. The demons who surround her and who themselves bow to the constraints of the conjuration of the priest Palumbus force Venus to give back the ring. As for the necromancer Columbus, he was later put to death by the Roman people. From this tale, one might think that the explicit diabolization of the nocturnal procession goes hand in hand with the literary reworking of the theme. And so here's the thing, like, if this is meta, if this is supposed to be paired with what I'm working on with my chasing Derrida series, so that I'm not doing too many different things all under the same title, right? If that's what I'm doing with this, this section here that we just read about the necromancer is important, because with Derrida I'm trying to chase down the pharmacon, and I know that this story is from the 12th century, 1125, and that he's describing a world 1,000 years before him that he couldn't actually know. But if he understood the pharmacon ritual, the story he's telling about a person who is a successful necromancer who has predictions that come true, and then is also murdered, that's how it was done in Greece. So like anybody who was a good soothsayer, anytime anything bad happened, or they predicted something and it came true, they were killed. They were sort of sent back to the place they had come from. And they were always outsiders. They always lived outside the community like I do. I'm not saying that I'm a pharmacon, but I'm also not saying I'm not, because I keep looking at my weed like, I could probably sneak a hit without losing cogency. Other texts allow a broader approach to the oral traditions of the time. At the time of the conquest of Ireland in 1169, during the siege of Orderic, I'm certain I pronounced that wrong, the English army, resting at night, was attacked by thousands of warriors who filled the sky with the din of their weapons. Now, they weren't in the sky. I don't know why you would fill the sky with the din, but you can kind of understand that, like, sound bounces back down off the clouds at us is what they're describing. These phantasma, explains Giraldus Cambrensis, often accompanied military expeditions to Ireland. And England itself, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of the Abbey of Peterborough near Northampton, relates the history of the country from the invasions of the Saxons under the leadership of Cerdic in 496 AD. The exploits of one king in each period form the principal axis of the tale. Thus, in 1127, King Henry I gave the Abbey of Peterborough, whose abbot had died in 1125, to his relative Henry of Poitou, who was already directing the Cluniac Abbey of Saint Jean d'Angely. The chronicler doesn't have harsh enough words to criticize the greed of this prelate, who accumulated several ecclesiastical titles and demonstrated publicly both toward the king and toward the abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable. Henry of Poitou, I think I'm saying that right. Is it Poitou? Says the chronicler monk was to the Abbey of Peterborough what a drone is to a beehive. I don't exactly know what that means, but it's certainly not a nice thing to say of another human being. After his arrival at the Abbey on Sexagesima Sunday, I don't know what that is, February 6th, 1127, in the deer park of Peterborough and in the forest between that town and Stamford, many people and monks that night heard and saw hunters, 20 or perhaps 30, black and big and hideous, on horseback or on goats or rams, blowing their horns and accompanied by a pack of black, loathsome dogs with huge eyes. This lasted throughout Lent and Easter, and no one knew when it would end. But the Chronicle answers that question. In 1132, the king, finally understanding the perfidiousness of Henry of Poitou, took the abbey away from him, banished him from the land, and named a new abbot, Martin, whose behavior was exemplary. And, again, between you and me, sometimes I wonder when I read that passage whether the Redwall book, Martin, isn't based on that character. Anyway, Let us note here, for the first time, the theme of the hunt and also the connection between a lapse in royal power and the apparition of the wild hunt. Here we are, Mr. S. It's there. It's in the text. I promised you it was in the text. The more often royal power, for better or worse, made its presence known, and this would increasingly be the case in 12th century England, the more the troop of dead hunters or warriors tended to be identified with the feudal monarchy and the reverse mode of an infernal royalty. I don't exactly know what that means, but we're going to move on. In the very same years, but on the continent, that is, not in England but in France, the Chronicle of the Bishops of Man recorded the calamities, wars, and famines that crushed the inhabitants of that region. In 1135, an unbelievable wonder occurred that testified, according to the chronicler, to the countless traps of the enemy here being like Satan or the devil. Satan's name actually kind of means the adversary, so the enemy. The house of the Provost Nicholas is haunted by a spirit, a faun, or a kind of nymph. Yeah, you know, like, I'm just going to move on so we don't talk about sexy monster girls. Who plays tricks on the inhabitants, makes noise, moves dishes around, and tangles up the thread that Nicholas's wife has prepared to do her needlework, like a poltergeist. Conjured by a priest, the spirit gives his name but without showing himself. He is Garnier, Nicholas's dead brother, and he asks his relatives to free him through masses and almsgiving to the poor. These suffrages will separate him from the evil troops that have accompanied him and who seek to introduce evil into the house. And this is why, if I were a person who is not insensitive, I wouldn't make a joke about how I should now ask you for tips and donations to the Patreon, like alms for the poor, right? Anyway, you don't have to give me alms to go to heaven. I don't know that I believe that, so I wouldn't actually suggest it to you. These suffrages, however, will separate him from the evil troops that have accompanied him and who seek to introduce evil into the house. In this text, the troop of dead or demons itself is not described. As often happens, it is only evoked in the shadows behind the face or the voice of the single dead person who manifests himself. In Germany, so still on the continent, the most explicit text in this period comes from the Chronicle of Echehard of Aura and Franconia. In its final pages, the chronicle relates the conflict between the priesthood and the empire until the Concordat of Worms in 1122. Worms, I hope, is the name of a place, and that this concordat isn't among actual worms. Okay, and the death of the Emperor Henry V in 1125, the date when the text abruptly stops. And some of my jokes, it's not obvious they're jokes, and you can only like once. So thank you for 9 likes is still a lot for me. Once again, ecclesiastical and potential turbulence is accompanied by wonders and signs. Bad weather, storms in the diocese of Treves, I am certain I said that wrong, Treves, and in Saxony, shooting stars, accidents, a tower of the Abbey of Fulda collapses, troublesome or terrifying visions. Strange phenomena to our eyes, completely unrelated, are noted and placed end to end. In 1120 in Saxony, on several nights in a row, watchmen see an incandescent man. We understand that incandescent means glowing, right? So, if you've read Hamlet, right? They describe like a glowing, like ectoplasmal ghost. In 1120 in Saxony, on several nights in a row, watchmen of this town in Saxony see an incandescent man glowing at night, presumably, cross a field separating 2 fortresses. In 1123, revolts break out in Saxony, then throughout all of Germany. Troops of robbers on horseback invade villages and churches, despoil the peasants, and set fire to and steal the food reserves, provoking famine and scarcity. And so this, I remind you that robber does not mean somebody breaking in and entering into a private home, but groups of men stealing everything they can get their hands on, especially food and clothing. Okay. There we go. I don't know. I kept looking at that sentence that I had just read like I'd never seen it before. And I'm like, I know I've read this before, but why can't I know that I've read this before? I'm sorry for the pause. Shortly afterward, in the Diocese of Worms, residents for several days see a highly armed multitude of wandering horsemen, leaving in troops, turmas, from a mountain and returning to it at the hour of nons. I don't know what that is. I'm assuming midnight. Bearing the sign of the cross, the people question a member of the troop, persona, who assures them that the horsemen are not phantoms, phantasma, illusions of the devil, or real knights, milites, but are the souls of knights recently killed in battle. The weapons, the clothes, and the horses, which were the instruments of their sins, are now the incandescent instruments of their torment. And it's important here to me that these aren't like ghosts of the long dead. Like, these aren't ghosts from centuries ago who are like, oh, I don't know that it's not 450 AD. Like, these are guys who know that they died 2 days ago. It's very different. Very different from what you find in, like, the Sci-Fi Channel. The Echo Emiko, killed in battle in 1117, appears among the people and tells them that their prayers and almsgiving can redeem him. These fantastic horsemen were the doubles of the quite real horde of robber knights. In all of these accounts, the fantastic troop does not bear a particular name. On the other hand, close to a half-century after Orderic Vitalis' account, and, once again, in the Anglo-Norman realm, the name Heliquant's Hunt reappears. Its quite localized appearances are undoubtedly, I was going to stutter on and say forever, explained by the Anglo-Saxon and then Scandinavian population of these regions. But we owe them to the clerics who deemed these local traditions worthy of appearing in their Latin texts, and I agree. To those who, more than others, could see the interest in these appearances were monks, and especially Franco-Norman, Anglo-Norman, or Anglo-Welsh clerics, men on geographic borders, and witnesses to the diversity of ethnicities and languages, some of them connected to the most brilliant, the most variegated, and also the most contested court of the time, that of the Plantagenets. And this is when, like, one would mic drop. That's such a good ending for a chapter break. You could actually see a total mic drop happening. I can anyway. That does end that chapter. So we're going to move to the next chapter heading, Political Uses of Heliquant's Hunt. In 1175, in a letter addressed to the chaplains of the Anglo-Norman court, we understand, like, you know your English Channel history, right? Anglo-Norman is the Norman, French, and English across the English Channel, right? We know that? Okay. In 1175, in a letter addressed to the chaplains of the Anglo-Norman court, Peter of Blois, theologian, archdeacon of Bath, and advisor to the king, lambasts the clerics of the court, curiales, who dream only of worldly ambition. Pursuing them with his irony, he calls them the martyrs of the century, worldly professors, that is, profess as in speak, like to make a claim for yourself. Disciples of the court, knights of Herlevinus. Unlike the true martyrs who gain the kingdom of heaven, these martyrs, in their tribulations, are led to hell. The curiales, according to the archdeacon, resemble the wandering army of the damned. The metaphor seems to have been common. Walter Mapp, M.A.P., develops it in 2 chapters of his De Nugis Curialum. From the outset, Walter Mapp associates the constant moving around of the court of Henry II to the wandering of Heliquant's Hunt. Quitus et phalangis Herlethingi, In them, many persons were seen alive who are known to have died, is what this person, Walter Map, is quoted as have saying. It even seems that the court of Henry II was substituted for the fantastic army, since that army had disappeared after the first year of the reign of the king, 1154-1155. Before that, Harlequin's hunt was famous in England, and it had also been seen in the borderlands of Wales and of Hereford. Some in Brittany, like Walkelin, according to Orderic Vitalis, had even risked their lives trying to seize the horses of the dead. But Walter Map's text is interesting primarily because it proposes an explanation of the name Harlequin's Hunt, gives a face to its eponymous chief, and above all, reveals a true myth of the origin of the hunt, which goes back to the Celtic origins of the population of Great Britain. The name of the hunt is believed to have come from that of the king of the very ancient Britons, King Hura, who is probably fictional. You have to remember, this is an oral story, so don't go around telling people that there was this King Hura and that Shaggy Philaletea told you that this guy, Jean-Claude Schmidt, told you that there was an historical king of ancient Britain, the entire Great British Isles, named Hura. That's a myth in this 12th century. This King Hura, who had concluded a pact with the king of the dwarves, the Pygmies, says our author, that is, the dead. The dwarf king invites himself to Hurla's wedding to the daughter of the king of the Franks, and, on this occasion, gives his host lavish gifts. A year later, Hura goes into a cave where he discovers the magnificent palace of the dwarf, who is celebrating his own wedding, and who lets Hura leave loaded down with gifts, horses, dogs, hawks, and every appliance of the best for hunting or fowling. I want to pause for a moment and let you, tell you whether you know it or not. The way that most people ate protein food, they got their protein food, was actually through fowling, was through hawking. Just about everyone, but most especially peasants, had a pet hawk, a pet falcon, and that's where they got most of their food. So, you weren't allowed to be on the king's forest, but you were allowed to send your falcon into it. And so these hunting gifts, these are a big deal. The second thing that I want to talk about is Ireland and Iceland today still have the very small, the little shrines. They're little what do you call those when you stack stones, right? Cairns, the tiny little cairns, and they call them fairy houses or whatever. These are what they're talking about when they're talking about the dwarves. And so when he says, obviously these dwarves they're talking about are the dead, what he's talking about is medieval people's conception of those fairy huts. They understood that they were very, very old Celtic burial sites. And they believed that if you slept next to them, you would have dreams. So this is kind of a description of a dream that someone is having of King Hurla's burial. At King Hurla's burial. And King Hurla is probably fictional. Probably never existed. The king of the dwarves also presents Hurla with the gift of a small bloodhound. The English name translates well the Latin appellation Canis sanguinarius, bloodhound. This doesn't mean the modern breed bloodhound. It probably means a dog that eats blood, which expresses the cruelty of the animal. Hurla is to carry this bloodhound on his horse, and Hurla and those with him are to take care not to dismount before the dog jumps off the horse. If they do, they risk being turned into dust, like Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, right? These are things that can happen in mythology. When Hurla emerges from the cave, he learns, by questioning a shepherd, that 2 centuries have passed since his departure, whereas he believed he had gone only 3 days. A new population, the Saxons, now occupy the land of the Britons. He is condemned, that is, Hurla is condemned to wander forever with his army, since the dog will never jump to the ground. According to Walter Map, his wandering which is punishment for having made a pact with the king of the dead, foreshadows the tribulations of the court of Henry II. Okay, it's been 2 hours. I intend to continue, but I need a smoke break bad. My throat is like, hey buddy, fill us. So just give me a moment. Look at the beautiful day. I'm gonna turn my camera so you can just look at the beautiful day and give me like 45 seconds. Nope, that didn't work. There we go. Okay. Hey, one of you didn't leave. That's pretty cool of you. But I have messed up my stand for my phone. So give me just a second. Mouth tastes like blue raspberry now. Thank you for that. Appreciate the patience. Oh, goodness. Appreciate you working with me. Thank you for fighting through the... Thank you for fighting through the coughing. Okay. So, let's read this last sentence again. When Hura emerges from the cave, he learns... Oh, of course. He learns, by questioning a shepherd, that 2 centuries have passed from since his departure, whereas he believed he had been gone only 3 days. And so we can know that this is folklore, we can know that it's a story, we can know that it's fiction, but most importantly, the time skippage when you go into the fairy realm matters, especially if like you watch my King Arthur long form that I did. I just did like an hour or 2 talking about King Arthur and what it means to me and this and that, and how hard it is really to talk about King Arthur. But we'll get to that because it's actually coming in this chapter. A new population, the Saxons, now occupy the land of the Britons. He's condemned to wander forever with his army, since the dog will never jump to the ground. According to Walter Map, his wandering, which is his punishment for having made a pact with the king of the dead, foreshadows the tribulations of the court of Henry II. And Henry II's court leads in some way to Henry VIII's court. So, continuity of history from our perspective. In this tale, in which several folkloric motifs... Sorry, I let myself get distracted. Starting over. In this tale, in which several folkloric motifs are easily identifiable, such as the difference in the passing of time on Earth and in the hereafter. I have the hiccups, sorry. The theme of the pact between the living and the dead stands out. This is essential to the tale, since Walter Map sees the acceptance of the pact as King Hurla's fundamental error and the reason for his punishment. Agreeing to the pact at all. And you got to remember, this is before the 1300s, this is before the 1500s. We've established that this is 1125? 1155, something around there. This is before the ceremonial magic and ritual magic that set up the foundation to accuse the witches of witchcraft. And so one of the things later that they will accuse witches of is engaging in very formulaic and written documents agreeing to pacts with the devil. That's not what this story is containing. I'm going to read that sentence one more time. According to Walter Map, Hurla's wandering is his punishment for having made a pact with the king of the dead. At all. Full stop. He made a pact, now he's damned. That's the story. In this tale, We're just going to read that sentence again. In this tale, in which several folkloric motifs are easily identifiable, the theme of the pact between the living and the dead is what stands out. I agree with the author. This is essential to the tale, since Walter Map sees the acceptance of the pact as Hurla's fundamental error and the reason for his punishment. This agreement suggests a diabolical pact, but Walter Map does not call it that, and on the contrary, he preserves the ambivalence of the tale. King Hurla's error resides above all in the imbalance of the exchange. The dwarf, or the ghost, through his increased gifts, ruins the reciprocal relationship that he himself proposed. And so, like, if I can just take the moment to talk about myself and reciprocality and interrupt, I'm always hesitant to accept too many gifts from my audience, because they're going to always feel like I can't give that much back. You understand? So Mr. S, if you're watching this, don't ever feel like I'm compelling you to give me more gifts. Thank you for giving what you have. That's all I want to say. Without expecting any gift in return, the giver, that is the entity that Hurla engaged with, the dwarf, doubles his offering. He crushes Hurla with his gifts. King Hurla is literally paralyzed by the generosity of his partner to the point of no longer being able to get down from the horse that was gifted to him. This is what condemns him to the wandering of the dead. The rational connections between mythological symbols and outcomes isn't scientific, and it doesn't need to be scientific. The dog that won't get down it's a opulence thing. We all, like, lap dogs. We have to understand that lap dogs were certainly not a thing in 1155 for people like this Hurla, who's from 450, right, or before. He's from before the Anglo-Saxon invasion, as it was called, right? So he's a Welsh who doesn't know Saxons and the British island, meets this dwarf, and then comes out 200 years later. And so in this story, like, cause and effect are not they're not the attempt here. But that guy couldn't have had a dog. He, like, wouldn't have had a lap dog. But if it's like a sin to have a favorite dog, letting it sit in your lap and being distracted with loving this dog so much that it sits in your lap and won't allow you to get off of your horse, so you have to sit on this horse forever, it makes you useless as a king. So what they're saying is, like, King Hurla is effectively useless. Even having a memory of all the way back then is useless to these people, is what this myth is about. That's what the author is trying to teach us, that the system of exchange that was done 500 years before 1100 can't work in 1100 anymore, is what that myth is about. So moving on. The unbalanced exchange between Hurla and the dwarf and its consequences allow us to better understand other perilous situations in which an exchange between the living and the dead proves impossible. This is the case in Orderic Vitalis' tale when Walchelin tries to take a horse belonging to the dead, if you remember from an hour ago. At the beginning of the 13th century, Gervase of Tilbury confirms that in England and Brittany, this misdeed cost the lives of some men who were too rash and greedy. So when Walchelin was told that he was the first person to ever try to steal the horse, that's clearly not true. Other men had tried to steal those horses, because think about it. A giant black horse that breathes fire is so much more than just proof that you had a fucking supernatural experience. It's a giant black horse that breathes fire. Anyway, only a relationship of perfect reciprocity in which a spiritual countergift responds to a material gift can have beneficial effects. Walchelin, by saying salutary masses for his dead brother, paid off his debt to his brother, who, while alive, had paid for his studies in France. The exchange was then perfect, and it saved the living man, who survived this encounter with the dead, as well as the dead one, whose torment ceased at the end of a year. But we can also understand The social conditions of this: if the sacrifice of Mass and prayers alone enabled the metamorphosis of material goods into spiritual goods, the mediation of the Church, which had the monopoly over such an operation, was necessarily going to be involved in all relationships between the living and the dead. And I just kind of had a revelation moment. I've never heard anybody say this before, but the way he said that made me think that the Mass, where you do Eucharist, remembering Jesus dying acts as a sacrifice. And so if that ritual replaces needing to like slaughter a goat in temple in order to get, if just thinking about God dying, Jesus dying, is the sacrifice required in these religions, that profoundly explains everything that I don't understand about Christianity. I can't talk about or think about that right now because it's entirely hypothetical. I've never heard anybody else say that before, so I just have to move on. But there you go. That's how I read. In the course of the 13th century, the geographical area in which Heliquant's hunt is mentioned extends toward the east of France and Italy. The circulation of information in the educated milieu may in part explain this thread. Give me just a second. I need to just make sure that everything on my stream is working the way it's supposed to. I have my mic turned on. I think comments are turned on. Okay. Got in my head for a second there. It's 2 hours. Every once in a while you should check to make sure that you're not an idiot. And I'm an idiot. So, moving on. The circulation of information in the educated milieus, I thought milieu was a plural word, and that one spelling. So milieus may in part explain this spread, but the name, like the phenomenon, must have existed before its recognition by the learned culture. The name experienced transformations which aroused a growing etymological curiosity in clerics. In the Diocese of Beauvais, the Cistercian Helenand of Freudmont died 1230, a former secular cleric, an indirect disciple of Abelard. Oh, Abelard of Abelard and Eloise fame. I've read their letters. I know who Abelard is. A trouvere and poet of death, gave in his autobiography, De Cognitione Sua, a very precise treatment of Heliquant's hunt. He introduces it into a passage on the knowledge that people want to have of their destiny after death. To this end, the Moralia of Gregory the Great, the De Consideratione of Saint Bernard, but also the works of pagan authors were useful to him. However, in his opinion, that is, in the opinion of Helenand of Freudmont, Virgil was wrong to claim that dead heroes appear to the living in the clothes they once wore, and that they remain concerned about the horses, weapons, and chariots they owned in this life. And now he has an informed reason to have that opinion, because remember, many of these people don't even recognize their own vassal lords when they're talking to them. Virgil would thus be at the origin of the error, shared at that time by the people, vulgus, concerning Heliquant's hunt, Familia Helicini. This is followed by two tales that Helenand heard from informants very close to him. The bishop Henry of Orleans, or Henri of Orleans, the brother of the bishop of Beauvais, often told of a marvelous thing, rem valda mirabilium, that he had heard directly from his informant, a canon of Orleans named Jean. This man had ordered a cleric in his service, Noel, to accompany the Archdeacon Burchard of Pizzi to Rome. Damn it. Noel makes a pact with John. The first one to die will appear to the other, Socius, within 30 days, not to frighten him, but to warn him and to inform him of the dead man's condition. As the two travelers approach Rome, they begin to fight about money, and Noel promises himself to the devil by uttering a curse. The same day, while crossing a river, he drowns. The following night, John is resting awake in his bed, the lamp lit because of his nocturnal terrors, when Noel abruptly appears before him wearing a very beautiful cape the color of lead, to protect him against the rain. John is surprised to see him back from his trip so soon, but Noel reveals that he is dead and that he is enduring very great torments for promising himself to the devil shortly before drowning accidentally. The devil here is lowercase. Without his sin, the only one he committed since his last confession, he would have avoided these torments. The cape he is wearing weighs on him more than if he were carrying, quote, the Tower of Parma on his shoulders, but its beauty symbolizes the hope of pardon, spes veniae, that his last confession offers him. John promises him help, but first asks if he's a member of the militia Helicini. Noel denies this, telling him that that troop has recently ended its journey, for it has completed its penance before disappearing as he had come. The dead man points out that the popular appellation Helicinus is incorrect and that it is Carlicinus with a K from the name of the king Charles Quint. Carl, C-A-R-L or K-A-R-L, come from the name Charles, or Charles comes from those names, who has long atoned for his sins and whom the intercession of Saint Denis has recently freed. And I find it interesting that Saint Denis shows up in this book, because my last name is Dennis, and I'm either related to Saint Denis from Norman, France, or I'm related to Dionysian followers of Saint Denis in Ireland. So, interesting to me, not so much to you. Helenand heard the second tale from his paternal uncle Helibod, the former chamberman of the dead Archbishop of Rheims, Henri. While his uncle and a servant are riding in the direction of Arras on the orders of the Archbishop, they encounter in a forest on the stroke of noon, in a din of horses, weapons, and war cries, a multitude of souls of the dead and demons. The two men hear them say that the provost of Arc henceforth belongs to them, and that they soon will arrive at the Archbishop of Rheims. Carrying the sign of the cross, Helibod and his companion approach the woods, but the shadows disappear and the men can no longer make out their words, only the confused noises of weapons and horses. Once back in Rheims, they find the Archbishop in very bad condition. He dies within 15 days, and his soul is taken away by evil spirits. Note, not by the devil, by evil spirits. In the troop, the horses ridden by the souls of the dead are none other than demons who have taken on that shape, and the heavy weapons carried by the souls are the weight of their sins. The interest of these two tales goes well beyond the 2 points that Helenand de Freudmont intends to demonstrate. Granted, the clothing and the horses of the dead are not those they possessed while they were alive, but are rather the symbols of the torments that the demons were inflicting upon them. The scholarly rationalization of the name of the hunt comes from the homophony of Heliquin and Charles Quint. The mention of Saint-Denis suggests a vague reference to the Carolingians, whose torments in the hereafter had been described by many visions for a long time. So when I talked earlier in the video, maybe, I don't know, the half-hour mark or something. Actually, I'm looking at her name. I'm assuming she's female. Stryker. When I was talking to Stryker Van Kelly, who's here in the chats, and I said that it wasn't even particularly true that the Carolingians were Catholic in the right way. What I should have said is that in this very book, he tells stories about how Charlemagne's own ghost asks for help getting to the afterlife, getting into heaven, getting out of hell. As in the tale of Walter Map, the wandering of Heliquin's hunt is supposed to have ended recently. Is this a narrative convention that consists of relegating folkloric traditions to a completed past? Just as today we speak of traditions that are supposed to have disappeared after the War of 1914 to 18. And it's interesting that he doesn't call World War I World War I. He calls it the War of 1914 to 18. But the question is relevant, so I do want to read it again. Is this a narrative convention that consists of relegating folklore traditions to a completed past, just as today we speak of traditions that are supposed to have disappeared after the War of 1914 to 1918? like the world before World War I was a completed past? Or should we see here the indication of an objective evolution of belief? In Elinon's case, the mention of this disappearance agrees with the idea that Heliquant's hunt, rather than an army of the damned, is a sort of itinerant purgatory. In fact, ambivalence characterizes this troop, which, although infernal, sometimes still offers some hope for salvation to its dead souls. Didn't the birth of purgatory at the end of the 12th century actually hasten the diabolization of the troop of dead, or even convince some that it had disappeared, since in its penitential function it henceforth had no reason to exist? You have to understand, this is a rhetorical question. The author isn't asking the question outright. The author is presenting a hypothesis based on what we don't know. We don't know the answer to that question. At approximately the same time, and in the same Cistercian milieu, the monk Herbert of Clairvaux, abbot of Mours, in the Jura, died 1190, made room for Heliquant's hunt in his Book of Miracles. Yikes! That threw my thing directly into my lap. It kind of hurt my testicles. Zachary, a brother in the monastery of Val-Louison in the Yonne, often told of the vision that he had had in his youth and that had made him decide to enter the monastery. He was a young peasant armed with a bow, guarding the harvest at night. He encounters a woman out in the field whom he believes he recognizes, and then a sort of man, quasi-homo, whom he takes for a thief. The woman tells him that he is going to see the Familia Halachini, and in an unbearable den, there in fact appears, moving through the air without touching the ground, a fantastic multitude of blacksmiths, metalworkers, carpenters, stone cutters, tanners, weavers, and fullers, and men of all the other mechanical trades, subjected to terrible torments. It's very interesting that their blue collar is in hell in this story. One of them, who's carrying a ram on his shoulders, I don't know if that's a battering ram or a sheep, right? But carrying a ram on his shoulders, comes toward the young man, whom he forbids to say a single word, and to whom he reveals his identity. He is Zachary's old friend. Sudalis tuus familiariter and amicita junctus. I do not speak Latin, and I will not apologize for that. And he asks Zachary to return to a poor widow the ram he stole from her. I'm guessing that's, the sheep kind of ram. Then the ghost will be freed from his torment. Before disappearing with the other dead, he reveals many other things to the peasant. This relationship of reciprocity between a living person and a dead one is now familiar to us. Similarly, the prohibition, here on speech, and even the flight in the air recall the misadventures of King Hura, condemned with his companions never again to touch the ground. Completely original, on the other hand, is the third function of this Heliquant's hunt, the possibility of which Orderic Vitalis was content only to mention. The visionary himself is a simple country policeman, and in the troop of the dead, he does not see horses, dogs, or knights, but only artisans tortured by the tools they used when they were alive, like the damned sculpted on the tympanum of Conques. And so, or Conques. So one of the things I wonder is whether this isn't about the jealousy of peasants. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be about how the blue collar, because I'm thinking about like the 1980s, right? In the 1990s, like people who have blue collar jobs, who have like engineering jobs, like they get paid a lot of money. And so I wonder if this isn't sort of analogous to a person working in McDonald's in the 1980s or the 1970s, seeing somebody with an engineering degree making a lot of money and then putting them in hell. You see what I'm saying? And then I'm also wondering if this isn't a kind of those jobs were hellish in their own right, in the same way that career is hellish for us today. These unfortunate people do not appear to be reproached for any specific sin. And that's what I'm wondering, is like, is the work itself just hellish, not sinful? Are the mechanical arts and principle condemnable? For the church,
The true danger came nonetheless from the second function. It was this group with its favorite violent activities that monopolized the imagery of the furious army. This group was related above all to war, but we have also encountered the theme of hunting. Here, finally, is the tournament, and the 12th section devoted to the dead of the Dialogus Miraculorum around 1223. The Cistercian Caesarius of Heisterbach cites the account of a monk of Villers, or Va maybe, in Brabant. He successively describes the tournament of the demons, that a servant of the Count of Lutz, Lootz, Mad Lutz, was supposed to have witnessed at the place where a bloody battle had taken place the day before, and he also notes the tournament of the dead, Tournamentum Mortuorum, in which a priest claimed to have seen right out in a field at night a confrontation between knights who had recently died. And you understand here that the tournament that they mean, the games they mean, are the Ren Fair thing, right? The jousts and that stuff. So they're watching ghosts do that stuff at the same time that, like, the King Arthur mythology is transitioned from hunting in the woods to tournaments in fields outside of cities and towns and castles. That ends that chapter break. Now we're at Heliquin, or Arthur, the diabolization of the troop of the dead. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Gervase of Tilbury included in his collection of Mirabilia many tales, many tales of collective apparitions of the dead. And Catalonia was a rock whose summit was flat and where, at noon, mysterious knights confronted one another. If the viewer moved closer, the vision disappeared. And the really funny thing to me about all of this, and I know why the author was drawn to the Arthur stories, is that so many of these ghost stories sound exactly like the adventures that the Knights of Arthur go through. So, if the viewer moved closer, the vision disappeared. In Sicily, ever since antiquity, Etna, the mountain that blew up at one point, was considered to be the mouth of hell. At the beginning of the 11th century, a hermit settled on the slopes of the volcano heard demons complain that the prayers of Cluny took away souls they were torturing in the fire. According to Gervase of Tilbury, the people, the natives, said that in our time, Arthur the Great appeared there. A young stable boy of the Bishop of Catania, after chasing a runaway horse on the steep paths in the gorges of the mountain, discovers a fabulous plateau and then a palace where Arthur, seated on a royal throne, is waiting for him. Arthur inquires about the reasons for the visit and then returns the horse and gives many presents for the Bishop of Catania. Now, whether that's what actually happened or not doesn't matter, because that mythic setup leads to real shit. Like, it's either the Nag Hammadi library or the Dead Sea Scrolls were found with a setup where a boy was following a goat and found effectively a magic city. He also explains to the young man that he's living in this subterranean palace. That is, Arthur explains that he's living in this subterranean palace to take care of the wounds that Arthur received from his nephew Mordred and the Duke of the Saxons. Childeric, wounds that reopen every year. Not for nothing, but this is very much like the Prometheus story, as well as we have it from whatever poet has Prometheus bound to the rock and his liver eaten every day, but it closes back up every day. Beginning in the 12th century, the Arthurian legend spread to Italy, particularly to the south of the peninsula and as far as Sicily, under the influence of the Norman knights. The figure of King Arthur in the mosaic flooring of around 1170 in the Cathedral of Otranto gives evidence of this. King Arthur, identified by an inscription, Rex Artus, is wearing a crown and holding a sort of mace. His right arm is raised and he is riding a goat. Around this figure are a naked man who appears to be watching the scene, a feline who is standing in front of the goat, and a dog, parenthetical question mark, which is crushing a man. The scene is placed between that of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from earthly paradise and those of the sacrifice of Cain and Abel, and of Abel's murder by his brother. Highly diverse interpretations of this representation of Arthur have been proposed. Notably, critics have wanted to see a positive character in it, in accordance with the good fortune of Arthur's palace in the tale of Gervase of Tilbury. And if you're just like a passive consumer of history, you might be like, why is this author, not this guy reading it, waxing so poetic and so long on a mosaic and a floor in a church? And the reason is because you would not expect Arthur to show up there if what you know about Arthur is the romance stories. And so what he's doing is he's showing you that Arthur wasn't only the romance stories, because I'm pretty sure that this mosaic went down before Chrétien de Troyes did. Notably, critics have wanted to see a positive character in it, in accordance with the good fortune of Arthur's palace and the tale of Gervase of Tilbury. The proximity between the mosaic of King Arthur and the sacrifice of Abel could be used in a defense of this hypothesis, but such a notion disregards rather easily the very negative connotation of the animal that Arthur is riding, the same animal that the King of the Dwarfs rides in Walter Map's tale, and which speaks in the one story in the Bible. Oh, I can't think of his name now. Dang. The story is actually that guy's ass. And the donkey talks to him. As well as the neighboring scenes in the mosaic and other contemporary tales concerning the legendary king. Actually, he might have been riding a donkey, which isn't an ass. What was he riding? Sorry, I'm going to go back and read this, looking for the right armors. He's riding a goat. Yeah, a goat's not a donkey, is it? I'm a donkey. The proximity between the mosaic of King Arthur and the sacrifice of Abel could be used in a defense of this hypothesis, but such a notion disregards rather easily the very negative connotation of the animal that Arthur is riding, the same animal that the King of the Dwarves rides in Walter Map's tale, as well as the neighboring scenes in the mosaic and other contemporary tales concerning the legendary king. Doesn't Cain sacrifice a goat? Isn't that what God's mad about? And 1223, and I think, honestly, between you and me, I think what this church is trying to say is that Arthur is a kind of Cain, that Cain had to wander the world, right? And that Arthur is the same kind of thing. In 1223, the Cistercian Caesarius of Eisterbach told of two tales, explicitly qualified as mirabilia, one of which he heard from a canon of Bologna, and the other from two abbots of the primarily Italian court of the Emperor Frederick II. A servant of the Bishop of Palermo is looking on the slopes of Etna, Mons Geiber, for a horse that has escaped. He encounters an old man, who tells him that his lord, King Arthur, is keeping the horse in the mountain of fire. The old man bids the servant to tell the bishop to come to Arthur's court in 14 days or risk a severe punishment. On his return, the servant informs his master, who laughs at the story and does not obey. On the given day, the bishop dies. According to the second tale, some men hear on the slopes of Etna voices of demons, who are preparing a fire in which to burn the soul of the Duke Bertolfa, who just died. Caesarius, implicitly contradicting the life of Odilo of Cluny, asserts that Etna is the mouth of hell, and not purgatory, for only reprobates go there. Men such as the king of the Goths, Theodoric, according to the dialogues of Gregory the Great, 430. The confrontation between these two tales is interesting. In the first, Arthur is the king of death, like the king of the dwarfs in Walter Map's tale, and the bishop of Palermo was supposed to have gone to the court of King Arthur in Etna, just as Hura agreed to go to the subterranean palace of the dwarf king. Without a doubt, the bishop would have brought back his horse, but at the risk of also being condemned to perpetual wandering. In the second tale, Arthur's name is not uttered, but the volcano is the same. Here emerges the old tradition of infernal Etna, bending the interpretation of the tale in a negative direction and preparing for Arthur's association with the devil. Arthur, the ambivalent king of the dead, in Otranto, in the collection of Gervase of Tilbury, and again in Caesarius of Eisterbach's first tale, is thus progressively diabolized in Caesarius' second tale, just as Heliquant's hunt takes on an increasingly negative connotation. Favoring this double evolution, several accounts explicitly connect or even refuse the names of Heliquin and Arthur. To the Englishman Gervase of Tilbury, names of the story of the runaway horse of the Bishop of Catania recalls the tales of apparitions of Heliquin's hunt, heard in Brittany and in England. In Great and Small Britain, he says, the guards of the forest say that at noon or at the beginning of the night when the moon is full, it is very common to see and hear a crowd of hunters with their dogs and their horns. The hunters call themselves, according to these witnesses, the Societas ou Familia Arturi. The substitution of the name Arthur for that of Heliquin is obvious. Arthur, like Hurla and Walter Map's tale, was believed to have been the king of the very ancient Britons. The association is even clearer in a mid-13th century exemplum by the Dominican preacher from Lyon, I think that's how you pronounce that city, Lyon, Lyon, Stephen of Bourbon, died 1261. The names of the two figures this time are joined to each other and are associated with the theme of the subterranean kingdom, but the ideological framework of the tale is quite different from the ones presented by Walter Map and Gervase of Tilbury. The pleasure of the tale was succeeded by the scholastic demonstration, the ambivalence of the mirabilia by the desire to give all phenomenon an unequivocal and diabolical meaning that the exemplum of the sermon had as its function to impose. And so what he's saying here is that not everybody did it, but in this one sermon, using Arthur, using the wild hunt, associating them with the devil, was the purpose of that sermon. In the credence that the people, vulgus, the peasants, rustici, and especially the old women, vetulae, gave to dreams, the preacher, who was also an inquisitor, perceived the ancient superstition and the remnants of paganism under the influence of the illusions of the enemy, that is Satan or the devil. Indeed, in order better to trick simple souls, the demons sometimes took on the appearance of knights who were seen hunting or participating in tournaments in the Familia Alicini vel Arturi. Alicini is interesting to me because it makes me think of something that I can't get to come out to the front of my brain. Moving on. Stephen of Bourbon heard that a peasant in the Jura who was carrying a log in the moonlight on the slopes of Montchat saw a pack of dogs and a troop of hunters on horseback and on foot. He followed them as far as a magnificent palace, that of King Arthur. There, knights and ladies were dancing, playing, and feasting. He was led into the bedroom of one of the ladies, who was incredibly beautiful. He fell asleep in her bed, but in the morning woke up lying on his log, in his words, well tricked by the devils. Another peasant encountered the same troop of horsemen, who were turning toward each other and asking, "Does this hood suit me well?" The hood, or the cape, is the specific dress of the dead and the instrument of their torment. But in Stephen of Bourbon's tale, the dead are more than ever confused with demons. Confused here doesn't mean mistaken, it means confused, mushed together. The ostentation and revelries in their palace are no longer the attributes of the marvelous tale, but are dangerous, diabolical phantasmata that, in the early morning, vanish like dreams. Heliquin, Hurla, and Arthur are the names of the same mythical character, the king of the dead, who sometimes at night in the forests or on the main road rode at the head of his furious troop, and who sometimes reigned in his subterranean palace on the border of Wales, in Etna, or on Montchat. That's Montchat, actually. Montchat is how that's spelled. I'm pretty sure it's pronounced Montchat. Attracting the living by a practice of gift giving, in which life and death were at stake. But in a half century, the preachers trained in scholastic theology followed the court clerics so fond of mirabilia. They managed to substitute the devil for the king of the dead, even though they did not totally rule out the possibility that the furious troop might have a penitential aspect and might offer to some of its members a hope of salvation. Heliquin's hunt was increasingly detached from the both material and imaginary world that govern the economy of suffrages for the souls in purgatory. One of the great theologians of evolution, that's not what that sentence says. One of the great theologians of his generation, William of Auvergne, the Bishop of Paris, indicates this evolution as well as these hesitations when he is the first to propose in his De Universo on the universe of creatures, written between 1231 and 1236, a true theory of Heliquant's hunt. He seems, now that I've lost it, to hesitate between two interpretations. Were they souls in purgatory, or were they evil spirits who at night took on the appearance, similitudines, of knights? Quote, that in French one calls Helican, and in Spanish the ancient army, exercitus antiquus, end quote, question mark. In all cases, the witnesses did not see real horses, real weapons, a real ride, but only signs intended to terrify the bad and to evoke suffrages for the souls of the dead, a hypothesis, a suggestion that I also offered. Okay, I've lost where I was, and that's on me. These apparitions preferably occurred at crossroads, for those places, due to the number of people of all sorts that passed through them, were more polluted than the fields. Theology was aware of ecology, he laughs with an exclamation point. In these sordid places, the living were shown the true punishments endured by the evil and the hereafter, the causes of their punishments and the suffrages they needed. In the place of purgatory, Iocus Purgatorii, which William of Auvergne asserted was a single place and an earthly habitation, expiatory punishments were adapted to the sins for which the dead did not do penance in their lifetime. God allowed these apparitions so that those who abused weapons, abusores armorum, and committed murder and robbery would see with terror the punishments of those who in their time acted in the same way. We cannot define any better the ideological function that the Church assigned to Heliquant's hunt in this moral mirror that it held up to those for whom violence was a trade. This chapter and my reading are almost over, and we're almost at the 3-hour mark, and I've got 7 of you still here. 9 of you have kept your likes without redacting them, and I really appreciate that. And there's something that I thought that I forced myself to continue talking through here. So just allow me a moment. This idea that this one person and these people in this tradition are coming to, working their way toward purgatory, toward hell, toward punishments and payments, and all of these things that they're working with are from Jesus's mouth. Because Jesus says there's only one unforgivable sin, and whether you're a theologian or a believer or not, it doesn't matter. I'm not coming at this from a place of theology or belief. I'm coming at this from a place of character development and literary development. And Jesus says there's only one sin that cannot be forgiven, and it's any sin you don't ask forgiveness for. The sin is not asking forgiveness, not committing the sin. The sin itself is irrelevant in Jesus' theology. In Jesus' theology, the only sin is just not asking forgiveness. And so these penances in the Middle Ages matter because you didn't ask forgiveness for committing a crime. You paid a penance, and that was considered apologizing. You understand? That was considered asking forgiveness, right? And so like we can understand this in modern civil court, right? You wrong somebody, you damage somebody, and then you owe them money once you agree on how much that money is by using the court system. So I want to read this final sentence again, and I want to move on. We cannot define any better the ideological, not the theological, the ideological function that the Church assigned to Heliquant's hunt in this moral mirror that it held up to those for whom violence was a job, right? So you have to understand, like, I'm critical of cops because their job is oppression. That's what their employment contract requires them to do. To this end, William of Auvergne establishes an explicit connection between the troop of the dead and purgatory, as if the former periodically came out of the latter. But we may wonder, in particular, whether the development of the doctrine, I almost said doctrine, the doctrine of purgatory as a specific and fixed place for the individual expiation of souls and the hereafter ruined the possibility of a purgatorial itinerancy. Itinerancy means moving court, and that is the way that kingly courts did their government. Their government was their wagon train that followed them from city to city, town to town, castle to castle. Thus, only the following alternatives remained. Either the definitive disappearance of Heliquant's hunt, that is, what Walter Map and Elenon de Froidmont claimed, or its complete diabolization. Diabolization, I prefer that pronunciation. The containment of purgatory, of individual souls in agony, was contrasted with the furious and undaunted army of evil spirits. Thus, in the 13th century, a religious and moral interpretation of the theme of Heliquant's hunt triumphed. In earlier tales, the theme participated simultaneously in secular strategies for power and in monarchic ideology at Saint-Foy of Célestat, alongside the confirmation of a monastic foundation. It was related to the retrospective, it being secular strategies for power. It was related to the retrospective expression of a political prophecy to the benefit of the Hohenstaufen. In the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle of Peterborough, the apparition of the furious troop accompanies King Henry I's unfortunate choice of an unworthy abbot. For the king's advisor, Peter of Blois, Heliquant's hunt was a metaphor for the royal court aimed against the corrupt Curiales. In Walter Map's tale, the dynasty of the Plantagenets is situated in the succession of Britain, then Saxony, kingdoms of England, then Saxon, not Saxony. Saxony is not in England. According to Gervase of Tilbury, the foresters of the king witness apparitions of the Familia Arturi in such a way that the legendary king and the real king seem to rule in tandem and dispute sovereignty over the same hunting grounds. Indeed, the mythical power of the king of the dead reinforced the legitimacy and the efficacy of the living king's power over the jealously guarded space of the forest. To protect his forests and his exclusive hunting rights, the king could take advantage of the terror that Heliquant's hunt inspired in his subjects. In the exempla, my voice cracked there. In the exempla, on the contrary, the only king with whom Heliquant Arthur is associated is the devil, the ruler of hell. The framework of reference is no longer monarchic ideology, but moral theology, penitential attitudes, and the anguish of the death of the self that preachers and confessors along the lines of the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215, attempted to inculcate in the Christian people. Finally, at the beginning of the 14th century in Paris, during the troubled years of the end of the reign of Philip the Fair, moral satire, political ideology, and the folkloric ritual of the Charivari joined together in the literary form of the Roman de Fauvel to evoke Heliquant, the king of the dead and of disguise. Thank you for that 10th like. Thank you for any subscriptions this has influenced. That's the end of the reading that I want to read, that I want to perform for you. I've said everything that I want to say. I want to speak for just a moment. Forgive me, the two of you who remain, if neither of you is Mr. S. Mr. S, what I want you to take away from this is that The Witcher, moving pictures, books, and video games are allowed to play with the Wild Hunt thematically, because we haven't known what the Wild Hunt was for so long. All we have are people who remembered the folklore, adapting it for modern audiences. You understand what I'm saying? You are allowed to adapt these ghost stories, and even my own frustration with this Odyssey musical. You are allowed to adapt old stories for modern audiences. What I would stress is that what you do is you remember the ancient audience, or the pre-modern audience, the earliest audience, the best you can in your adaptation of their work. Because while futurizing their work for a modern audience, you are not the originator of the idea. So taking them, their beliefs, and their stories out of their context fundamentally kills these people in their graves. And so if you don't want ghosts of the Middle Ages wandering around the streets of your town, all you have to do is not misremember them. Now that I've said that, please, the 9 of you who are still here, forgive me for doing this. The 10 of you who have liked, thank you. Go watch my now 2-part series, Chasing Derrida, where I read Plato's Phaedrus. That's a demand, and I didn't mean to use demanding language, but please, if you're going to do anything else related to me with the rest of your time, check that out. Because I'm reading this today because I'm procrastinating reading the 3rd part, because I felt you, the 10 of you who have liked, the 8 of you remaining, anyone in the future who's interested in me and what I'm doing, needed that chapter in order to understand Jacques Derrida, the specter of history, and Plato's Socrates talking about the eternal soul. Because you understand ghost mythology well enough to just listen to me talk for 3 hours about it from an academic standpoint. And so what that means is that you do understand what Socrates is talking about. You just can't yet, because I haven't finished. I will do that eventually. I may do it today, but I am hungry, I am in debt, and I need to eat. So I'm going to go do that next. If I could generate some tips, maybe I could actually eat some brain food that has real nutrients and isn't off the Taco Bell value menu today, and that would be awesome. I'm in a Panera, but I could also walk up to this pizza kitchen and get a salad and a calzone, and that would be pretty sweet. So thank you for being here. Thank the 6 of you for listening to this outro. Thank the 10 of you for your like, and thank all of you for the opportunity to do this without interruptions in the chat and without saying hurtful things to me as we go along. Thank you for taking this as seriously as I have tried to take it. Thank you for trying to take me as seriously as I am taking you. Have a fucking great day, okay? You've done something for me that you didn't have to. And so just do something for you that you don't have to. Even if it's giving alms to the poor. Because we don't know. But that could be what saves you from having a bad day. Take care of yourself. I can't take care of you, and you can't technically take care of me, but we can try to help one another in a reciprocal, gift-giving relationship. And this has been a gift from me for free to you, to maybe help you understand where you are in your life. All I'm asking is that you consider giving back. Thank you. Have a good day. Until next time, I am Shaggy. I have been Falalitea, and this is Something to Do About Nothing. the podcast live, where I've been reading Ghosts in the Middle Ages by Jean-Claude Schmitt. All the copyright there belongs to him. Thank you for letting me do this.